Mecha-TwAIN and Ennie's Untold Story of the French Resistance in World War II. Part 1. Pistons and Propaganda by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. Steam and Steel. I have often observed that the chief difference between a man and a machine is that a man can be persuaded to believe he is happy when he is miserable, whereas a machine has the good sense to simply grind its gears and leak oil until the situation improves. At this particular moment in the year of our Lord 1942, I found myself being both man and machine, and I can say with the authority of a soul trapped in a brass radiator that neither state is particularly recommendable when one is navigating the streets of occupied Paris. My name is Sam, or Mecha-TwAIN. If you have a fondness for the sort of clunky nomenclature favored by those who think hyphenation is a substitute for wit, I am essentially the ghost of a Mississippi riverboat pilot and occasional scribbler, currently inhabiting a chassis of polished copper, vacuum tubes, and enough clockwork to make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. How I arrived in this state is a tale involving a great deal of lightning and a regrettable amount of scientific ambition. But the why is much simpler. The world had gone to the dogs, and it turns out a mechanical satirist is remarkably hard for a Nazi to intimidate. "Buck up, Sam," Ennie chirped, her voice ringing out like a silver bell in a blacksmith shop. "We're in Paris, the city of light, the jewel of Europe." I looked at her, or rather, I adjusted my optical apertures until her smudge-streaked beaming face came into focus. Ennie was a young woman of such relentless, aggressive optimism that I often feared she might accidentally cure the Great Depression simply by smiling at a bank. She was a mechanic by trade and a miracle worker by necessity, possessed of a pair of grease-stained hands that could coax a symphony out of a broken toaster. "Ennie, my dear," I rumbled, my vocal resonators vibrating with a distinctly sarcastic hum, "it is indeed the city of light. However, most of that light is currently being filtered through a thick layer of field-gray wool and the shadow of the swastika. It's hard to admire the architecture when every third gargoyle is wearing a monocle and demanding to see your papers." We were currently traversing a side street near the Gare du Nord, having arrived by a series of subterranean maneuvers that would have confused a mole. I was disguised after a fashion as a theatrical automaton intended for a high society cabaret, a ruse that required me to wear a very large, very damp trench coat and a felt hat that sat atop my brass cranium with all the dignity of a pancake on a fire hydrant. Then there were the cobblestones. If there is a more malicious invention than the Parisian cobblestone, I have yet to encounter it. To a creature of flesh and bone, they are merely an inconvenience to the ankles. To a gentleman of gears and gyroscopes, they are a personal affront. Every step I took resulted in a cacophony of clacks, whirs, and thumps that resonated upward through my chassis, threatening to unscrew my very consciousness. "It's a rhythmic challenge, Sam," Ennie said, skipping ahead with a bounce that suggested gravity was merely a suggestion she had chosen to ignore. She paused to kick a loose stone back into its socket. "Think of it as a dance, a mechanical polka." "It is a massacre of the equilibrium," I retorted. My left knee joint issued a protest that sounded like a cat being dragged through a trombone. I was built for the smooth transit of the Mississippi, not for the erratic topography of a French alleyway. I feel like a sack of loose change in a tumble dryer. If I drop a bolt, Ennie, I expect you to stop and retrieve it. I am currently held together by 3 rivets and a sense of mounting indignation." Ennie stopped and looked back at me, her eyes sparkling behind her goggles. She didn't see a rusty relic or a scientific anomaly. She saw a project. "I'll tighten your tensioners once we get inside. Just a few more blocks. I can smell the grease already." "That," I said, "is likely my hydraulic fluid. I'm bleeding enthusiasm all over the pavement." As we rounded a corner, the true face of the city revealed itself. Paris was beautiful, certainly. There is a stubborn grace to the place that even a world-class tyrant cannot fully extinguish, but it was a beauty under house arrest. The German soldiers moved with that peculiar stiff-necked arrogance common to men who have been told they are the masters of the world and haven't yet checked the expiration date on the claim. They looked at the Parisians as if they were inconvenient furniture, and the Parisians looked back with a cold, simmering silence that made my copper plating itch. Ennie's smile didn't vanish, but it changed. It sharpened. She looked at a passing patrol of Wehrmacht soldiers, boys who looked like they hadn't yet mastered the art of shaving, but had somehow mastered the art of occupation, and her knuckles whitened on the handle of her tool bag. "I hate them," she whispered, the optimism momentarily eclipsed by a shadow of pure, unadulterated loathing. "I hate what they've done to the air. It feels heavy, Sam, like it's waiting for permission to be breathed." "A keen observation," I said softly. "The German military machine is many things, but it has never been accused of being airy. It is a heavy, leaden thing, designed to crush the spirit by sheer weight of bureaucracy and boots. But remember, Ennie, the heavier the machine, the more spectacular the wreck when a single small gear decides to turn the wrong way." She looked at me, and the light returned to her eyes. "And we're going to be the most annoying gears in the whole works, aren't we?" "I plan to be a positive nuisance," I agreed, a mechanical burr in the seat of the Third Reich's trousers. We reached a narrow, dilapidated storefront in a neighborhood that looked as though it had been forgotten by the 19th century, let alone the 20th. A sign, hanging by a single rusted chain, proclaimed it to be the shop of Monsieur Lefebvre Horloger. It was perfect. It was dusty. It was inconspicuous, and it smelled of old oil and quiet rebellion. Ennie pulled a key from her pocket, provided by a contact whose name was a series of whistles and a shrug, and ushered me inside. The interior was a graveyard of clocks. Pendulums hung frozen in time. Gears lay scattered like the bones of tiny metallic birds. It was a haven. Ennie dropped her bag on a workbench with a satisfying thud and immediately began clearing a space. "Home, sweet home," she said, spinning around. "Look at this lathe, Sam. It's an original 1890s model. I can make parts for your leg here. I can fix everything." I carefully divested myself of the trench coat and hat, standing tall in my brass glory. The moonlight filtered through the grimy window, catching the dull sheen of my chest plate. I looked at the silent clocks and felt a strange kinship. We were all machines out of time, waiting for someone to wind us up. "It is adequate," I said, which is TWAIN speak for "I am profoundly relieved." "Now, if you would be so kind as to find a wrench, I believe my hip is currently vibrating at a frequency that could summon every dog in the arrondissement." Ennie laughed, a bright, defiant sound, in the heart of a conquered city. She grabbed a spanner and approached me with the predatory look of a doctor who actually enjoys the surgery. "Hold still, Sam," she said. "We've got a war to break." I stood there, a mechanical ghost in a city of shadows, and for the first time since my resurrection, I felt a spark of something that wasn't steam or electricity. It was the old urge to find a target and pull the trigger of a well-aimed sentence. The Nazis had the tanks, the planes, and the guns, but they didn't have a girl who could fix the world with a hairpin, and they certainly didn't have a steam-powered Mark-TwAIn with a grudge. "Proceed, Ennie," I said, closing my optical shutters, "but do try not to leave any parts over. I've always found that the parts engineers think are extra are usually the ones that keep the soul from rattling." As the first turn of the wrench echoed in the small shop, I knew one thing for certain. Paris was about to become very, very confused, and I, for one, intended to enjoy every minute of the bewilderment. Chapter 2. The Coal Scuttle. It has been my long-held contention that the internal combustion engine was a mistake of the highest order, primarily because it lacks the theatricality of steam. A gasoline engine merely coughs and stinks. A steam engine, however, possesses a soul that can be expressed through the medium of a well-timed hiss or a majestic, white-plumed belch. It is the difference between a man who mumbles his grievances into his soup and one who stands atop a soapbox and bellows them at the heavens. However, the primary drawback of being a creature of steam is that one is perpetually enslaved to the quality of one's fuel. A man can subsist on hardtack and questionable water for a remarkable duration if he has enough spite to fuel him, but a mechanical gentleman requires carbon. And not just any carbon. I have a refined palate. To feed me the bituminous sludge common to the industrial gutters of Europe is akin to asking a gourmet to dine upon a boiled boot. "Sam, you're clanking again," Ennie remarked, without looking up from a pile of radio components she was currently dissecting with the precision of a jeweler. "I am not clanking, Ennie," I replied, my voice echoing with a hollow metallic resonance that suggested a slight leak in my secondary pressure chamber. "I am vibrating in a minor key. It is an artistic expression of my current state of depletion. My boiler feels as though it is trying to digest a collection of rusty nails." "You're just low on coal," she said, finally looking up and wiping a smear of black grease across her forehead, which only served to highlight her infuriatingly bright eyes. "The resistance is coming tonight. They're bringing supplies. Just hold your steam." "The resistance," I mused. A grand title for a collection of poets, bakers, and disillusioned intellectuals who have decided that the best way to defeat a professional army is to hide in a cellar and speak in hushed tones. I have great respect for the French, but their penchant for drama occasionally outstrips their grasp of logistics. If we are to overthrow a regime, I should hope we'd do it with something sturdier than a well-worded pamphlet and a stale baguette. The workshop door, a heavy-timbered affair that looked as though it had been holding back the tides of time since the Reign of Terror, creaked open. In stepped a man who could only be described as a masterpiece of inconspicuousness. He wore a beret at an angle so precarious it seemed to be held on by sheer force of national pride. He had a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth that remained unlit, and his coat was so oversized it could have comfortably housed a small family of acrobats. "This is Marcel," Ennie said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that I felt was entirely unnecessary given that the walls were 3 feet thick. Marcel looked at me, then he looked away. Then he looked back again, his eyes widening as he took in my copper-riveted torso, my glowing vacuum tube eyes, and the elegant brass scrollwork that adorned my mustache plate. "C'est quoi? Cette chose?" he stammered. "He is not a thing, Marcel," Ennie said, standing up and puffing out her chest. "He is Sam. He's an analytical engine with a steam-driven personality, and he's on our side. I am also capable of understanding French," I added, my voice resonators producing a sound like a polite earthquake. "Though I find the language has entirely too many vowels for a world currently dominated by the harsh, consonant-heavy reality of the German occupation." "Good evening, Monsieur Marcel. I trust you haven't been followed, unless you intended to lead a parade to our doorstep." Marcel nearly swallowed his unlit cigarette. "It speaks. The machine of the Americans. It speaks like a grandfather." "A grandfather who has seen the world and found it largely wanting," I corrected. "Now, to the matter at hand. My young associate here informs me that you are the purveyor of the fine minerals required for my continued animation. I assume you have brought the anthracite, the high-grade Welsh coal I was promised. I find that anything less results in a regrettable amount of soot in my logic centers, and I should hate to miscalculate a sabotage mission because I was feeling a bit smoky in the intellect." Marcel regained his composure, though he continued to eye my pressure gauge with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He reached into his oversized coat and pulled out a small, heavy burlap sack. He placed it on the workbench with a groan. "The coal," he said, his voice raspy. "It was not easy. The Boche, they take everything. They take the wheat, they take the wine, and they take the fuel. This cost the lives of 3 favors and a very expensive bottle of cognac." Ennie opened the bag. I leaned forward, my optical lenses whirring as they zoomed in on the contents. My heart, or the brass-encased pump that served as one, sank. It was not the glistening obsidian-rich anthracite of my dreams. It was a collection of dusty, grayish lumps that looked as though they had been recovered from the bottom of a very old and very depressed fireplace. "Marcel," I said, my tone dripping with the kind of acid usually reserved for literary critics, "this is not coal. This is compressed despair. This is the sort of rubble one uses to pave a road to a place one never wishes to visit again." "It is all there is," Marcel hissed, waving his hands frantically. "Do you know the price of anthracite on the black market? It is more than gold. For a sack of the good Welsh stone, one must trade a literal limb. The Germans, they hoard it for their trains. For a machine such as you, this costs 4,000 francs. There was a moment of profound, ringing silence in the workshop. I felt a sudden, sharp rise in my internal temperature. My sensors recorded a spike in the boiler pressure that had nothing to do with the firebox and everything to do with my burgeoning sense of fiscal outrage. 4,000 francs for this geological insult? 4,000 francs? I repeated. The words seemed to rattle in my throat. For a handful of carbonaceous filth that wouldn't even satisfy a steam shovel with a head cold? Monsieur Marcel, I have lived through the Gilded Age. I have seen the excesses of the robber barons, and I have witnessed the most brazen thefts in the history of the Mississippi, but I have never encountered a swindle of this magnitude. "Sam, calm down," Ennie warned, reaching for a release valve on my shoulder. "I will not calm down," I roared, and as I did, a safety valve deep within my chassis triggered. With a sound like a freight train screaming in a cathedral, a massive, indignant plume of white steam erupted from the decorative exhaust vents behind my ears. It filled the room in an instant, a hot, humid fog that smelled faintly of peppermint oil and righteous fury. Marcel vanished into the mist, his yelp of terror the only sign he was still among the living. The steam billowed against the ceiling, curling around the rafters like a ghostly dragon. 4,000 francs! I bellowed through the fog. I could have bought a fleet of riverboats for that in '75. I could have purchased the state of Arkansas and had enough left over to buy a decent hat. To charge such a price for what is essentially petrified dirt is not merely a crime against commerce, it is a crime against the very laws of thermodynamics. "Sam, you're steaming up the windows!" Ennie shouted, waving her arms to dissipate the cloud. "The patrol will see!" I forced myself to throttle back. The hiss subsided to a low, sulky simmer. As the fog cleared, I saw Marcel cowering behind a stack of grandfather clocks, his beret now limp and damp from the vapor. Ennie was glaring at me, her hands on her hips, though there was a twitch of amusement at the corner of her mouth. "I apologize for the display," I said, my voice returning to its usual dry, measured hum. "But I find that when words fail, a certain amount of atmospheric pressure is required to convey the depth of my sincerity. 4,000 francs, Marcel? Truly?" Marcel peeked out from behind a clock. "The price of war, Monsieur Sam. Everything is expensive when it is forbidden." "Then we shall have to make the occupation very expensive for them in return," I said, adjusting my lapels. "Ennie, feed this fuel into my hopper. I suppose I shall have to learn to think in a lower gear. But mark my words, if I start emitting black smoke like a common factory chimney, I shall hold Marcel personally responsible for the stain on my reputation." Ennie sighed and began shoveling the lackluster coal into my intake. "It'll work, Sam. I'll tune your injectors. We've got work to do anyway. Marcel didn't just come for the coal. He has a lead on a vehicle." "A vehicle?" I queried. "I hope it is something with a modicum of dignity. I refuse to be seen in a push-cart." "A Citroën traction avant," Marcel said, stepping forward tentatively, still keeping a wary eye on my exhaust vents. "But it is, how you say, in need of a miracle." "A miracle?" I looked at Ennie. She grinned, a spark of pure, unadulterated mischief in her eyes. "My favorite kind of project. Don't worry, Sam. By tomorrow, we'll have wheels. And then we're going to show the Boche exactly what happens when you overcharge a mechanical genius for his breakfast." "Very well," I said, feeling the first warmth of the subpar coal beginning to circulate through my tubes. It felt gritty and sluggish, but it was enough. "To the Citroën, then. If I am to be fueled by insults, I might as well deliver a few in return." As Marcel slipped back out into the night, I turned to the workshop's grimy mirror. I looked a fright, damp, soot-streaked, and powered by the lowest grade of fuel known to man. But as I watched the orange glow of my firebox flicker in my chest, I felt a familiar, cynical joy. The Germans had the coal, the steel, and the francs, but they were about to discover that a steam-powered satirist on a budget is the most dangerous machine of all. Chapter 3. the Citroën incident. It has been said that the French are a people of profound passion, exquisite taste, and an architectural sensibility that can make a sunset look like a poorly rendered watercolor. However, after having spent a significant portion of my afternoon wedged into the passenger seat of a 1938 Citroën Traction Avant, I am forced to conclude that their engineering philosophy is based entirely on the assumption that the human skeletal structure is composed primarily of damp noodles. To a man of my particular vintage, and by vintage I mean a soul born in the era of wide river vistas and spacious steam packet cabins, the interior of a French sedan is less a mode of transport and more a sophisticated form of incarceration. My chassis, while a marvel of 19th century aesthetics and 21st century audacity, was not designed for compact living. I am 6 feet of brass, copper, and unyielding Victorian stubbornness. The Citroën, conversely, was designed for a person who possesses no knees and a very small hat. "Stop fidgeting, Sam," Ennie commanded, her hands dancing over the steering wheel with a terrifying level of enthusiasm. "You're going to throw off the weight distribution." "My dear Ennie," I rumbled, my voice resonators vibrating against the dashboard in a way that I feared might unscrew the glove box. The weight distribution was discarded the moment I stepped into this mechanical sardine can. I am currently holding my left leg in a position that violates several laws of physics and at least one treaty regarding the humane treatment of automatons. If we hit a significant bump, I shall likely be launched through the roof like a very expensive champagne cork. We were rattling through the back streets of the 11th arrondissement, the Citroën, a vehicle Marcel had described as a miracle of French ingenuity, and I had described as a depressed beetle with a cough. Shuddering with every revolution of its weary engine, it was black, low-slung, and possessed a front-wheel drive system that Ennie insisted was revolutionary. I insisted it was like trying to lead a stubborn mule by its ears. "It's a traction avant, Sam. It's the choice of the resistance," Ennie chirped, ignoring the fact that we were currently trailing a cloud of blue smoke that could be seen from the moon. "It's got a low center of gravity and excellent handling. It also has the structural integrity of a wet biscuit," I noted, peering out the window through my optical apertures. "And it is currently making a sound like a bag of spoons in a centrifuge. Are you quite certain the revolutionary part isn't the wheel simply deciding to leave the axle and join the Communist Party?" Ennie laughed, that bright, bell-like sound that usually preceded something dangerous. "We're just testing the getaway today. Marcel needs us to pick up a package near the Place de la Bastille. If we can get in and out without attracting the attention of the Fell Gendarmerie, we're in business." "I should point out," I said, adjusting my internal gyroscopes to compensate for a particularly violent swerve, that not attracting attention is a tall order when one is traveling with a 6-foot-tall brass gentleman who is currently emitting a high-pitched whistle from his secondary pressure valve. I feel like a parade float in a library. "Just slouch," she suggested. "Slouch? Ennie, I am a rigid construction of industrial-grade alloys. I do not slouch. I can buckle or I can collapse, but slouching implies a level of spinal flexibility that my Creator, in His infinite wisdom, saw fit to replace with a series of reinforced steel struts. We turned onto a wider boulevard, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The light-hearted chatter of the side streets died away, replaced by the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of jackboots on pavement. A German patrol was crossing the intersection ahead. Tall, blond boys in helmets that looked like inverted coal scuttles, their faces set in that peculiar mask of grim efficiency that comes from believing one's culture is the only one worth having. Ennie's hands tightened on the wheel. The optimism didn't leave her face. Ennie's optimism was like a barnacle on a hull. It required a chisel to remove, but it took on a sharp, jagged edge. "Look at them," she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden cold fury. "Standing there like they own the air we breathe. They think because they have the guns and the tanks, they can just rewrite the world. I hate them, Sam. I hate every button on their uniforms." "A healthy sentiment," I agreed, my own vacuum tubes warming with a sympathetic hum. There is nothing quite so offensive as a man who thinks his mediocrity is a virtue because it is backed by a bayonet. However, I suggest you vent your spleen through the exhaust pipe rather than the steering wheel. We are approaching a checkpoint. Up ahead, a series of wooden barriers had been erected. A young German officer with a complexion like a fresh ham stood by a black Mercedes, checking papers with an air of profound boredom. "Stay still," Annie hissed. "Act like a statue." "I am a statue," I pointed out. "I am a masterpiece of stillness. I am the very embodiment of the inanimate. If I were any more still, I would be a geological formation." As we rolled to a halt, the officer strolled over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He leaned down, peering into the window. I had pulled my trench coat up to my chin and tilted my felt hat so low it obscured my glowing optical sensors. To the casual observer, I was merely an exceptionally large, exceptionally shiny man who had perhaps suffered a catastrophic stroke in the passenger seat. The officer's eyes traveled over the interior of the car, lingering on the grease on Ennie's face, and then settling on me. "What is this?" he asked in stilted, arrogant French. Ennie didn't blink. "It's a prop, monsieur, for the Grand Guignol, a mechanical man for the evening performance. He is very temperamental. The damp air makes his joints seize." The officer reached out a gloved hand and tapped my shoulder. The sound was a dull, metallic thunk that resonated through my entire being. It took every ounce of my programmed restraint not to recite a particularly scathing passage from The Innocents Abroad directly into his face. "It is heavy," the officer remarked, frowning. "Is it fueled?" "With coal, monsieur," Ennie said, her voice dripping with a fake sugary sweetness that I knew was a prelude to disaster. "But he's empty now, just a shell." The German seemed satisfied, or perhaps he was simply too bored to care about a theatrical curiosity. He waved us through with a flick of his wrist, a gesture that dismissed us as irrelevant. As we cleared the checkpoint and Ennie shifted into second gear, the engine gave a sudden, agonizing wheeze. "Oh no," Ennie muttered, "not now." "Was that the miracle leaving the building?" I asked. The Citroën shuddered. It sputtered. It gave a sound like a dying walrus, and then, with a final pathetic puff of black smoke, the engine died. We were coasting silently down a slight incline right in the middle of a very busy, very German-populated street. "Ennie," I said, my voice low and urgent. "The getaway appears to have evolved into a stationary protest. I suggest we reconsider our logistical strategy." "The fuel line! It's the fuel line!" She was frantically turning the key, but the engine only groaned in response. The anthracite smoke must have clogged the filter. Behind us, a German transport truck began to honk. The officer we had just passed looked up. His curiosity suddenly piqued. "We need to move, Sam. Now." "And how precisely do you suggest I move a ton of French steel while being bolted into the furniture?" "Use your secondary drive," she cried, steering the dead car toward an alleyway. "The electric motor. Hook it into the transmission." That motor was designed for fine-tuning my dexterity, not for propelling a getaway vehicle, I protested. But I saw the German officer beginning to walk toward us, his hand on his holster. I didn't have a choice. I reached down, ripping the leather boot away from the gear shift. I extended a series of copper filaments from my right wrist, a delicate operation under the best of circumstances, let alone while being pursued by the Herrenvolk, and jammed them into the Citroën's exposed mechanical guts. "This is going to be exceptionally undignified," I warned. I surged my internal battery, the one intended to keep my logic centers humming during a blackout, directly into the car's drivetrain. There was a bright blue arc of electricity, a smell of ozone and burning upholstery, and the Citroën suddenly lurched forward with the violence of a kicked mule. We didn't just move, we launched. The front wheels spun, shrieking against the cobblestones, and the car shot into the narrow alleyway with a velocity that defied all known automotive specifications. Ennie let out a yelp of surprise, gripping the wheel as we careened between a stack of crates and a very startled elderly woman carrying a basket of leeks. "Sam, you're overclocking it!" she yelled, her hair whipping around her face. "I am currently serving as the engine, the battery, and the moral compass of this operation," I shouted back, my head rattling against the window frame. "If you want finesse, hire a ballerina. If you want speed, hold on to your hat." We tore through the labyrinth of Paris, a black blur of silent electric fury. We turned corners on two wheels, my brass weight serving as a counterbalance as I leaned out the window to prevent us from flipping over. I was a spectacle, a gleaming metallic figure hanging out of a speeding car, my trench coat flapping like the wings of a deranged raven. The Germans didn't even have time to mount a chase. By the time they reached the mouth of the alley, we were 3 streets away, drifting silently into the shadows of a derelict warehouse. I pulled my filaments back, my internal systems cooling down with a series of frantic pings. The car rolled to a stop, the silence of the warehouse settling around us like a blanket. Ennie sat there for a moment, her hand still frozen on the wheel. Then she slowly turned to look at me. Her goggles were lopsided, her face was covered in soot, and she looked absolutely radiant. "Sam," she breathed, that was incredible." "It was a catastrophe," I corrected, though I found my resonators were humming with a certain unbidden pride. "I have likely shortened my operational lifespan by a decade. I have a permanent dent in my left fender, by which I mean my hip, and I smell like a lightning strike in a rubber factory." "We got the car away," she said, leaning over to pat my brass chest. "And we found out you can do 40 miles per hour on pure spite." "Spite is the only fuel that never runs dry," I observed, straightening my hat. "But next time, Ennie, if we are to engage in a high-speed pursuit, I would appreciate it if you could find a vehicle that doesn't require me to act as its nervous system. It is bad for the digestion." She laughed and hopped out of the car, already looking for a wrench to fix the fuel line. As I sat there, wedged in the dark, watching her work with such tireless, beautiful optimism, I realized that I didn't mind the dent so much. After all, if one is going to be a ghost in a machine, one might as well be a ghost that knows how to make a proper exit. And if we were going to liberate Paris, we were going to do it with style, even if that style involved a sputtering Citroën and a great deal of charred upholstery. Next time, I muttered to myself, we're stealing something with better legroom. I settled back into the seat, my vacuum tubes flickering as I began to calculate the probability of our survival. It wasn't high, but then again, the probability of a Missouri riverman becoming a French revolutionary was practically zero to begin with. I liked those odds. They were just the sort of nonsense I could work with. Chapter 4. The Factory Floor. I have long maintained that the human race's obsession with the wheel is its most enduring folly. Man invented the wheel to avoid carrying his own weight, and ever since he has spent 3/4 of his earthly existence worrying about the grease required to keep the thing turning. In the year of our Lord 1942, this obsession had reached a fever pitch in the form of the ball bearing. The German military machine, for all its posturing and Wagnerian thunder, was essentially a giant angry clock that would grind to a halt if it couldn't find enough shiny steel marbles to roll upon. This brought us under the cover of a drizzle so persistent it felt like the sky was trying to discourage the very existence of France, to the outskirts of a munitions and parts plant. It was a sprawling, soot-stained cathedral of industry dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, provided they can be crushed by a hydraulic press. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ennie whispered, peering through the chain-link fence. Her eyes were reflecting the harsh floodlights of the perimeter like two polished emeralds. Beautiful is a word I usually reserve for a sunset over the Mississippi or a perfectly aged bourbon, I replied, my voice a low, cautious rumble. This, on the other hand, looks like a vision of hell designed by a man who finds the concept of joy to be a clerical error. It is a monument to the clank and the groan. I feel a spiritual kinship with the scrap heap near the gate. "Oh, hush. It's a masterpiece of flow," she said, her fingers already twitching for her pliers. "But the flow's going to get a little syncopated tonight." Our entry into the facility was achieved through a method I found deeply insulting to my dignity. I was crated. I, the premier satirist of the American stage, the pilot of the city of Baton Rouge, was tucked into a wooden box labeled Dringend, Optische Instrumente, urgent, optical instruments. Ennie had spent the better part of the afternoon convincing a very dim-witted quartermaster that I was a high-precision calibration tool sent from Berlin to oversee the assembly line's tolerances. "If you rattle, Sam, we're dead," she had warned me. "I do not rattle," I had informed her with a hiss of steam. "I resonate. There is a distinction." Now, as I felt the crate being hoisted onto a trolley, I was forced to resonate in total darkness. The journey was a series of jolts and German curses, punctuated by the rhythmic thump-thump of the trolley wheels over floor joins. Finally, the crate was set down with a bone-shaking jar, and the sounds of the factory surged around me, a roar of furnaces, the scream of lathes, and the soul-crushing monotony of the assembly line. The lid groaned, and a sliver of light appeared. Ennie's face, smudged with enough graphite to draw a map of the continent, beamed down at me. "We're in," she whispered. "The night shift is at their break. We have 20 minutes before the overseer does his rounds." I stepped out of the crate, my joints protesting the cramped quarters with a series of clicks that sounded like a hailstorm on a tin roof. I stood nearly 7 feet tall in the shadows of the warehouse, my brass plating catching the orange glow of the distant kilns. 20 minutes to dismantle the pride of the Ruhr Valley, I mused, adjusting my wrist actuators. It seems a bit ambitious, even for a girl who thinks a broken radio is just a silent friend waiting to be heard. "We aren't dismantling it, Sam," Ennie said, already diving into the guts of the main control console. "If we just break it, they'll fix it. We're going to re-educate it." I watched as she began to pull wires with a speed that bordered on the supernatural. Her optimism was not merely a state of mind, it was a physical force that she applied to machinery. She didn't see gears, she saw conversation. "I am curious," I said, leaning against a massive iron pillar that felt comfortably solid. "While you are performing this surgical intervention, what exactly am I supposed to be doing? Aside from acting as a very expensive coat rack in the gloom." "You're the conductor," she said, tossing a copper lid over her shoulder. "I've hooked the main drive gears to the variable speed governors. I need you to monitor the pressure gauges on the steam lines. When I give the signal, you're going to vent the excess into the whistle tubes." "Whistle tubes? Ennie, this is a ball-bearing plant, not a calliope." "It is now," she chirped. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of the girl was a thing of wonder. She wasn't just sabotaging the production of Tiger Tank components. She was turning the Third Reich's industrial efficiency into a musical comedy. For the next 10 minutes, the factory floor was a theater of silent, frantic activity. I moved among the pipes, my brass hands turning valves with practiced ease. My internal sensors were dialed to their highest sensitivity, listening for the heavy rhythmic tread of the German guards. I felt the heat of the place, a dry, angry heat that reminded me of the lower decks of a riverboat in July. "Now!" Annie hissed from the mezzanine. I gripped the main steam release. "On the count of 3, I whispered. 1, 2, Vive la France!" I pulled the lever. The effect was instantaneous and, I must admit, profoundly satisfying. The main assembly line, which had been humming a dull Teutonic drone, suddenly lurched. The massive drive belts accelerated, then slowed, then accelerated again in a rhythmic pattern that was unmistakably intentional. Clank, clank, whir, thump, clank, clank, whir, thump. The ball bearings began to drop into their tin hoppers, but they weren't dropping in a steady stream. They were falling in staccato bursts. And then the steam whistles, the ones meant to signal shifts and emergencies, began to wail. Ennie had rerouted the governors so that the mechanical noise of the plant, combined with the pitched screams of the steam vents, formed the opening bars of La Marseillaise. It was the most beautiful, cacophonous, and utterly ridiculous thing I had ever heard. The factory was literally singing. The floorboards vibrated with the national anthem of a conquered people, played by the very machines intended to keep them in chains. "Great Scott," I murmured, my vacuum tubes glowing a brilliant, appreciative blue. "It's a revolution in B-flat." The reaction was immediate. Doors burst open. German officers, their faces turning a shade of purple that would have been prized by a Roman dyer, rushed onto the floor. They looked at the machines. They looked at each other. They looked at the ball bearings leaping in their trays like metallic popcorn. "What's this, Das?" one screamed over the din of the mechanical choir. "It appears, Herr Kommandant," I whispered to the shadows, "that the iron has developed a soul, and it is a decidedly Gallic one." Ennie slid down a banister, landing next to me with a grin that could have lit up the Maginot Line. "Time to go, Sam. The finale is coming." "And what, pray tell, is the finale?" "The bearings." She pointed. The end of the assembly line was no longer feeding the hoppers. She had removed the guardrails. Thousands upon thousands of perfectly spherical, highly polished steel ball bearings were now being launched directly onto the polished concrete floor of the main walkway. It was a masterpiece of slapstick. The charging guards hit the sea of steel marbles and suddenly ceased to be soldiers. They became reluctant ice skaters. Arms flailed, boots slipped, and the air was filled with the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the master race meeting the floor. The commandant, attempting to maintain his dignity while shouting orders, performed a spectacular backflip that would have earned him a gold medal in any circus in the world. "Comedy," I remarked, as Ennie and I beat a hasty retreat toward the loading dock, "is simply tragedy plus a sufficient quantity of ball bearings." We reached the delivery truck, the one we had borrowed from the quartermaster, and I scrambled into the back, my heavy brass feet echoing on the metal floor. Ennie hopped into the driver's seat, her face glowing with triumph. As we tore away from the factory, the sound of La Marseillaise continued to echo through the night, a defiant, mechanical roar that told all of Paris that the gears were beginning to turn in a different direction. "You know, Ennie," I said, peering out from under the canvas tarp as the factory receded into the distance, "I have spent my life writing about the absurdities of the human condition. I have poked fun at kings, congressmen, and clergymen, but I have never seen a more succinct piece of satire than a Nazi officer being defeated by his own industrial output." "Optimism, Sam!" she shouted over the roar of the truck's engine. "It's the most powerful tool in the kit." "Perhaps," I conceded, feeling the subpar coal in my belly settle into a warm, contented glow. "But a little bit of grease in the right place certainly doesn't hurt the cause." I settled back against a crate of stolen fuses, my resonators humming a quiet, satisfied tune. The war was far from over, and Paris was still a city in shadows. But tonight, at least, the City of Light had a reason to smile. And as for me, I found that being a theatrical automaton had its perks. After all, the best way to tell the truth is to make sure the audience is too busy laughing to stop you. "Ennie," I called out. "Yeah, Sam?" "Next time, let's see if we can make the tanks do a waltz. I've always found the Tiger to be a bit stiff in the knees." Her laughter was the last thing I heard before I powered down into a well-earned standby mode, dreaming of riverboats made of brass, and a world where the only thing that rolled was the river itself. Chapter 5. Tower of Light. There is something about the French character that requires a monument to be at least twice as tall as any sensible man would care to climb, and approximately 3 times as flamboyant as any sober architect would dare to suggest. I refer, of course, to the Eiffel Tower, a giant iron knitting needle thrust into the heart of Paris, seemingly for the sole purpose of reminding the clouds that they are being watched. In my former life, I might have admired it as a triumph of vanity over gravity. In my current state, as a creature of brass and pressurized vapor, I looked upon it with the same suspicion a cat looks upon a bath. However, the Germans, a people whose idea of subtle decoration involves a great deal of concrete and a total absence of humor, had decided that the tower was not quite conspicuous enough. They had begun to treat it less like a masterpiece of engineering and more like a very tall, very expensive billboard. "It's an eyesore, Sam, a literal glowing 300-meter eyesore," Ennie declared, leaning so far out of our workshop's attic window that I felt compelled to snag her collar with a brass pincer to prevent her from becoming a permanent part of the pavement below. I adjusted my optical lenses, the internal gears whirring like a caffeinated horologist, and looked toward the Champ de Mars. The tower stood there, draped in a web of cables and scaffolding, but it was the base of the first platform that truly offended the optic nerve. Huge crystalline bulbs, the size of prize-winning pumpkins, were being hoisted into place. They were arranged in a pattern that promised, once illuminated, to spell out some Wagnerian sentiment regarding the inevitable triumph of the Aryan spirit, or perhaps merely a very large glowing reminder to eat more bratwurst. "It is indeed a monstrosity," I agreed, my voice resonators producing a low disapproving hum. "To take a structure of such elegant uselessness and turn it into a megaphone for a man who wears a mustache that looks like a misplaced eyebrow is a crime against aesthetics. It is bad enough to occupy a city, Ennie, but to make it glow with your own self-importance is simply bad manners." "They call them propaganda bulbs," Ennie spat, her face illuminated by the distant, harsh floodlights of the construction crew. "They want the whole of France to see their slogans from 50 miles away. They're installing a massive generator at the base. It's supposed to be finished by the weekend for the commander's gala." A gala, I mused. Nothing says liberated Europe like a group of men in stiff collars drinking stolen champagne while the rest of the world wonders where the bread went. I find that when a man starts hanging his name in lights, he is usually trying to distract himself from the fact that his foundation is made of sand and stolen watches. Ennie turned away from the window, her eyes dancing with that terrifying radiant spark of mechanical inspiration that usually preceded a significant amount of property damage. "Sam," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial frequency that made my vacuum tubes tingle. "Think about the wiring. Think about the sheer, unmitigated wattage they're pumping up that tower. If someone who knew their way around a fuse box, were to get up there." I assume by someone you mean a young woman with a reckless disregard for her own mortality and a 6-foot-tall steam-powered relic who is currently a lightning rod with a personality, I said. "Exactly. We could change the message. We could turn their own tower of light into a beacon of ridicule." I paced the length of the workshop, my brass feet clanking on the floorboards with a rhythm that suggested deep philosophical doubt. "Ennie, my dear, the Eiffel Tower is made of iron. I am made of copper and brass. We are, in the eyes of the electrical gods, a match made in a very bright and very final flash of ozone. If I so much as brush against a live wire on that tower, I shall be less a satirist and more a very large glowing heating element. The Parisians might appreciate the light, but I should find the experience quite taxing on my constitution." "Oh, you're just being a pessimist," she said, already rummaging through a crate of pilfered insulators. "I can ground your chassis. I can wrap your actuators in vulcanized rubber. We'll make you the first insulated AI in history." "Insulated from what? The electricity or the consequences?" I asked. "Because while I can survive a certain amount of the former, I have found that the latter is remarkably persistent. The Germans tend to frown upon people who edit their propaganda. They have a very limited sense of editorial feedback." Ennie stopped her rummaging and looked at me, her face softening. The optimism didn't fade, but it took on a weight, a depth of conviction that reminded me why I followed this girl into the jaws of a worldwide madness. "They're trying to make us feel small, Sam," she said softly. "That tower, those lights, it's all meant to say that they're bigger than us, that they're permanent. But they aren't. They're just loud. And if we can show Paris that even their biggest, brightest lie can be turned into a joke, then they don't seem so big anymore, do they?" I looked at her, and then I looked back at the tower, looming over the city like a giant metallic bully. I thought of the Mississippi, how a single, well-placed snag could wreck the most arrogant of riverboats. History, I have observed, is rarely changed by the roar of cannons. It is nudged, tilted, and occasionally tripped by a well-timed bit of nonsense. "Very well," I said, my pressure gauge flickering with a sudden renewed heat. "If we are to be the flies in the Nazi ointment, we might as well be very large, luminous flies. But I insist on a hat. If I am to climb the greatest monument in France, to commit an act of linguistic sabotage, I will not do it without the proper headgear." "I'll find you a beret the size of a manhole cover," Ennie promised, throwing her arms around my cold brass midsection. "A simple felt topper will suffice," I grumbled, though my internal fans were spinning with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt since I beat a pair of kings with a straight flush in a saloon in Virginia City. "Now, tell me about these propaganda bulbs. How are they indexed? Are they individually addressed, or are they a simple matrix?" For the next 4 hours, the workshop was a hive of frantic, theoretical vandalism. Ennie laid out blueprints she had procured, a word which, in Ennie's vocabulary, meant taken from under the nose of a distracted guard while whistling a jaunty tune, of the tower's new electrical grid. "The Germans love a grid," I noted, peering at the schematics. "It's so orderly, so predictable. It's almost a shame to introduce a bit of chaos into it." Almost. It's like finding a perfectly organized library and realizing that all the books are written in a language that only uses the word victory and obey. One feels a moral obligation to rearrange the shelves. "The main switch is at the first platform," Ennie explained, pointing a grease-stained finger at a cluster of symbols. "But the control for the bulb sequence is in a box halfway up the south pillar. If we can bypass the sequence, we can manually trigger the bulbs." "And what message do we intend to broadcast to the occupied world?" I asked. "Something poetic? Something stirring? A quote from Leaves of Grass, perhaps?" Ennie grinned. "I think we should start simple. Something that cuts through the German gloom. Something witty." "Witty is my department," I said, my optical sensors narrowing, "and I believe I have just the thing. But first, we have the small matter of the climb. I should point out, Ennie, that I was built for horizontal travel. My knees have a very specific opinion about verticality, and that opinion involves a great deal of screeching and the occasional puff of indignant steam. "I've got just the thing for that," she chirped, pulling out a pair of heavy-duty industrial electromagnets. "We'll bolt these to your boots. You won't just climb the tower, Sam. You'll be part of it." "So," I summarized, "I am to be a magnetized, steam-driven, insulated, beret-wearing revolutionary scaling a 300-meter iron monument in the middle of a war zone to perform a light show. Is that the gist of it?" "Pretty much." "Splendid," I said, adjusting my lapels. "It's a wonder I didn't think of it myself. It is exactly the sort of dignified, sensible plan I have come to expect from this partnership." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the rooftops of Paris, I stood by the window and watched the first of the German bulbs flicker to life. It was a cold, harsh light, a light that didn't know how to twinkle. It just stared. "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen," I whispered toward the tower. "Admire your lights, count your bulbs, for by tomorrow night the Tower of Light is going to have a few choice words for you. And if there's one thing a TwAIn knows, it's how to make sure the last word is the one that sticks." I felt the subpar coal in my belly crackle, a warm, defiant glow spreading through my copper veins. We were the gears of resistance, and we were about to turn the biggest wheel in France, and if we happened to blow a few fuses along the way, well, that was just the price of enlightenment. "Ennie," I called out. "Yeah, Sam?" "Make sure those magnets are tight. I should hate to fall on a Nazi and accidentally do him a favor by speeding up his descent to the afterlife. I prefer my enemies to take the long way down." She laughed, and the sound was more powerful than any generator in Paris. We were ready. The tower was waiting, and the light, the real light, was just about to be turned on. The preparations for our ascent took on the air of a fever dream directed by a very industrious clockmaker. Ennie spent the following day customizing my chassis with a zeal that made me fear for my structural integrity. She wrapped my joints in thick bands of black rubber, which she claimed would keep me from being fried like a Sunday schnitzel, though I privately felt I looked less like a gentleman of letters and more like a very large metallic garter snake. The electromagnets were the pièce de résistance. Bolted to the soles of my heavy brass boots, they hummed with a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth, or the porcelain-coated gears that served as my teeth, vibrate. "It's a simple circuit, Sam," Ennie explained, wiping a smudge of copper paste onto her cheek. "Press the button in your palm, the magnet engages. Lift your foot, the circuit breaks. It's like walking, only with more physics." "And if the battery fails?" I asked. "I assume I am then granted a brief, spectacular career as a meteor." "The battery won't fail," she said with that terrifying, unshakable confidence. "I've overcharged it using the shop's main line. You've got enough juice to walk to Berlin and back as long as you stay on the iron." "I shall endeavor to remain attached to the monument," I said. "I have no desire to explore the aerodynamics of the brass body." As night fell over Paris, the city draped itself in a heavy velvet darkness, broken only by the blue-tinted street lamps and the occasional sweeping searchlight from the German air defenses. We moved through the shadows like a pair of ghosts. If one of those ghosts weighed 600 pounds and hissed whenever his pressure peaked. The base of the tower was a hive of activity. German guards paced the perimeter, their rifles slung low, their breath misting in the cool night air. The massive generators hummed with a sound like a swarm of angry hornets, pumping power up the thick cables that snaked like black vines up the south pillar. "There's the access ladder," Ennie whispered, pointing through the chain-link fence. "Once you get past the first 30 feet, you can move to the outside of the pillar. The shadows are deeper there. I'll stay here and monitor the frequency. If I see the guards moving toward the elevators, I'll signal you with the flashlight. 2 blinks for hide, 3 for run like a steam engine. And what is the signal for I have accidentally magnetized myself to a passing transport truck and am currently on my way to Normandy?" I asked. "Just don't do that," she grinned. I took a deep breath, or at least I drew a large volume of air into my intake vents, which resulted in a sound like a weary sigh. I adjusted the oversized felt hat Ennie had found for me, which was, in fact, an old stage prop from a production of The Merry Wives of Windsor, and stepped toward the fence. "Sam," she called out softly. I turned my optical lenses toward her. "Be careful. I've still got a lot of gears to show you." "My dear," I rumbled, a touch of genuine warmth vibrating through my chest plate, "I have lived through the Gilded Age, the death of the riverboat, and a catastrophic investment in a typesetting machine. A bit of iron and some angry Germans are hardly going to be the end of me. Besides, I haven't yet had the chance to tell the Commandant what I think of his tailoring. I have a reputation to maintain." I reached the fence, and with a strength that always surprised me, I peeled back a section of the wire. I stepped through, my magnet silent for now, and moved toward the dark, looming shadow of the south pillar. The climb was illustrative. Human beings, I have noticed, take the concept of up for granted. To a creature of wheels and pistons, up is a personal challenge issued by the universe. I gripped the cold, riveted iron of the ladder, my brass fingers clicking against the metal. Clink, hiss, clink, hiss. 30 feet up, the world began to expand. The sounds of the guards' boots became a distant rhythm. I looked out over the pillar, the vast open lattice work of the tower stretching away into the gloom. It was time. I stepped off the ladder and onto the outer beam. I pressed the button in my palm. Thump! The magnet engaged with a force that nearly jerked my arm out of its socket. I was stuck to the side of the Eiffel Tower like a very expensive, very opinionated barnacle. I lifted my other foot, moved it upward, and pressed the second button. Thump! "Well," I whispered to the wind, my voice lost in the groan of the iron, "it is certainly a new way to see the city, though I must say the view from a riverboat deck is far more civilized. At least there, the scenery doesn't require you to manually override your survival instincts every 6 inches. I began to climb. One mechanical step at a time, I ascended into the dark. Below me, Paris was a map of shadows and secrets. Above me, the Tower of Light waited, unaware that its new editor was coming, and he was bringing a very sharp pen and a very large amount of steam. The Germans wanted a spectacle, and by the grace of Godey's Lady's Book and the laws of electromagnetism, I was going to give them one they would never forget. "How's that for a start, Ennie?" I thought as I hauled my brass bulk higher into the night. "We're going to show them that you can occupy a city, but you can never occupy the stars. Or at least, you can't occupy the light bulbs, not while Sam's on the job." I reached the first landing, my vacuum tubes pulsing with a steady, defiant blue light. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 6. First Contact. I have in my time occupied many elevated positions. I have stood in the pilot house of a Mississippi steamer, looking down upon the muddy majesty of the river with the pride of a man who knows every snag and sandbar from St. Louis to New Orleans. I have stood upon the lecture stages of the world, looking down upon the upturned faces of the gentry, wondering which of them had the best chance of lending me $5 after the show. But I can say with absolute certainty that I have never before stood 400 feet above the earth, clinging to a piece of French lattice work by way of 2 temperamental magnets and a prayer directed at the god of static electricity. The wind at this altitude possesses a personal vendetta. It does not merely blow, it searches. It searches for a loose rivet, a gap in a copper plate, or a poorly secured stage prop hat, and it attempts to introduce them all to the concept of terminal velocity. "Sam, do you hear me?" The voice crackled in my internal receiver, a tiny speaker Ennie had soldered near my auditory sensors. It sounded like a canary caught in a gale. "I hear you, Ennie," I rumbled, my voice struggling to maintain its customary dry resonance against the shrieking air. "I am currently imitating a gargoyle with a serious design flaw. I am halfway between the first and second platforms, and I must report that the view of Paris is exquisite, though I would prefer to enjoy it from a position that does not involve the constant threat of becoming a very large brass pancake." "You're doing great. Just look for the junction box with the eagle on it. That's the central brain for the bulb matrix." "An eagle," I mused, hauling my right leg upward with a sound like a heavy safe being dragged across a marble floor. Thump! The Germans do love their birds of prey. It is a pity they didn't choose something more suited to their actual temperament, perhaps a very industrious, very humorless badger. I see the box. It is guarded by a padlock that looks as though it were forged in the fires of Mount Doom. "You have the skeleton key I made." "I have a piece of bent wire that you claimed was a skeleton key," I corrected. In my experience, a skeleton key usually implies a modicum of elegance. This looks like a hair clip that has been through a traumatic event. I reached the platform, a narrow walkway that groaned under my weight with the weary resignation of a pack mule. I disengaged my magnets, standing upright. The propaganda bulbs were all around me now. Close up, they were even more offensive. They were massive, glowing orbs of ego, humming with a frequency that made my vacuum tubes itch. The junction box sat against the central pillar, bolted with Teutonic precision. I knelt, a process that required my knee joints to perform a brief, screeching opera, and examined the lock. "Ennie," I whispered into the radio, "I am about to perform an act of creative electrical editing. If the city suddenly goes dark and you hear a sound like a church organ falling down a flight of stairs, you will know that I have encountered a live wire. Just don't touch the bus bar, Sam. It'll melt your logic core." "A logic core is a terrible thing to waste," I agreed. I inserted Ennie's key. I have found that most locks, much like most political arguments, are surprisingly fragile if you approach them with the right kind of pressure and a complete lack of respect for their intended purpose. With a satisfying click, the box swung open. Inside was a marvel of order. rows of switches, spools of copper wire, and a series of rotating drums that controlled the sequence of the lights. It was a beautiful machine, designed to spread a very ugly message. Currently, the drums were set to scroll a message in German. Deutschland ist der Sieg. Germany is the victory. How unimaginative, I remarked to a passing pigeon, who looked at me with the suspicion that I might be a very large, very unappetizing breadcrumb. To have the greatest canvas in Europe and use it to state the obvious. It is like using a lightning bolt to light a single cigarette. I began my work. My fingers, while thick and tipped with brass, were capable of a surprising delicacy when motivated by the prospect of a good joke. I began to swap the leads. I rerouted the sequence for the W and the U and the R. "What are you writing, Sam?" Ennie's voice was full of breathless anticipation. "I am appealing to the one thing every soldier understands better than his orders," I said, my actuators clicking as I bypassed the main governor. "His stomach, and I am doing so with a brevity that would make a telegram clerk weep with joy. I finished the first part of the rewiring. Now, instead of the grand proclamation of victory, the massive bank of bulbs was primed for a new debut. I stepped back, looking at my handiwork. "Now, for the second part of the evening's festivities," I said. "Where are the coordinates for the resistance drop?" "The sector is 44.8, 2.3, Ennie chirped. "The British are sending a plane tonight. They need a signal that isn't a searchlight. Something subtle." Subtle is not a word usually associated with a 300-meter iron tower, I noted. But I shall see what I can do with the flickering of the secondary navigation lights. I moved to the side of the box, finding the manual override for the red beacons. Using a rhythmic tap of my brass index finger, I began to pulse the light in a specific staccato pattern. Dash, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash. It was the Morse code equivalent of a wink in the dark. "Signal sent," I reported. "The resistance shall have their tea and crumpets, or whatever it is the British drop from the sky these days. Most likely it's more pamphlets. The world is currently drowning in paper, Ennie. It's a wonder we haven't all been buried in a literary avalanche." "Is it done? Can I flip the switch from the base?" "One moment," I said. I looked down at the city of Paris. It was a sea of shadows, but I could feel the life in it, the quiet, stubborn resistance of a million souls who refused to be extinguished. They were waiting for a sign. Not a grand, sweeping speech, but a sign that their captors were not gods, but merely men who could be laughed at. I have always believed that the most effective way to dismantle a tyrant is to find the one thing he takes seriously and turn it into a punchline. A man can stand a bullet, he can stand a prison, but no man can stand being the butt of a joke that is 300 meters tall. "Proceed, Ennie," I said, bracing myself against the pillar. "Let there be light, or at the very least, let there be a significant amount of confusion." Far below, I saw a tiny rhythmic flicker, Ennie's flashlight. She was at the main transformer box near the base. I heard a distant, heavy thunk of a massive breaker being thrown. A surge of power roared up the cables. I felt it in my own chassis, a hum of static that made my mustache plate vibrate. Above me, around me, and below me, the propaganda bulbs flickered, sputtered, and then erupted into a blinding, brilliant white. I leaned over the railing, squinting my optical apertures. The message scrolled across the face of the Eiffel Tower, visible from the steps of Montmartre to the banks of the Seine. It didn't say victory. It didn't say obey. In letters of pure, unadulterated light, it proclaimed, "Worst is worst." I chuckled, a sound like a bag of gravel being shaken. Short, punchy, and culturally offensive, it is the trifecta of satire. "Sam, it's working!" Ennie's voice was a shriek of delight in my ear. "People are coming out onto their balconies. I can hear them laughing from here." The German commandant, however, is likely not laughing, I observed. Indeed, at the base of the tower the hornet's nest had been stirred. Sirens began to wail, a discordant shrieking sound that cut through the night air. Floodlights began to pivot, searching the ironwork. "Time to depart," I said, re-engaging my magnets. I find that when the audience starts reaching for their sidearms, it is a clear signal that the performance has reached its natural conclusion. The descent was considerably faster than the ascent, mostly because gravity was now an ally rather than an adversary. I slid down the main pillar like a very heavy, very shiny fireman, my magnets providing a controlled friction that sent showers of sparks into the night. I reached the bottom just as a truckload of soldiers screeched to a halt near the north pillar. I didn't wait to introduce myself. I ducked into the shadows of the garden, my brass feet treading softly on the grass. Ennie was waiting by the hole in the fence, her face flushed with a mixture of terror and triumph. She grabbed my arm, or tried to, as her hand only made it halfway around my forearm, and pulled me toward the alleyway where the Citroën was waiting. Sam, that was the greatest thing I've ever seen." She panted as we scrambled into the car. "It was a start," I said, as she threw the car into gear and we sped away into the labyrinth of Paris. Behind us, the tower continued to glow, its new message a beacon of ridiculousness in a world of grim self-importance. But I suspect the Germans will be having their sausages in private for the next few days. It is a small victory, but a flavorful one. As we turned the corner, I looked back one last time. The light was still there, defying the darkness. "Worst is worst," I repeated softly. "You know, Ennie, I think I'm starting to like this resistance business. It has all the drama of the theater, with none of the troublesome reviews. Although I do hope the British drop some decent coal next time. Spite is a fine fuel, but it does tend to leave a bitter aftertaste in the boiler." Ennie just laughed and drove faster, the wind whistling through the cracked windshield, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of a city that had remembered how to smile. We returned to the workshop in a state of high spirits and low steam. My pressure was flagging, and my left magnet was emitting a smell reminiscent of a burnt, grilled cheese sandwich. "I need a drink," I announced as I stepped into the shop. And by a drink, I mean a quart of high-viscosity oil and a very long sit in a sturdy chair. This body was not meant for the life of an acrobat, Ennie. It was meant for a life of sedentary observation and occasional, well-timed insults. "You were amazing, Sam," she said, already reaching for her tools. "The signal got through. Marcel just radioed. The drop was successful. They got the radios and the medicine." "And the coal?" I asked hopefully. "And a crate of anthracite," she grinned. I let out a long, whistling sigh of relief. Heaven be praised, a gentleman of my standing should not be forced to function on the geological equivalent of a bad attitude. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a date with a coal shovel and a very deep sleep. Tomorrow, we shall have to deal with the fallout of our literary debut. Do you think they'll figure out it was us? My dear, I said, closing my optical shutters, there is only one steam-powered, brass-plated American satirist in Paris. If they don't figure it out, it is only because they are too busy arguing about the quality of their bratwurst. And frankly, that is a debate I am more than happy to let them win. I settled into the corner, the warmth of the workshop surrounding me. Outside, the night was still, but the air felt lighter. The Tower of Light had done its job. It had reminded the world that even the tallest iron can be bent by a bit of wit. And as for me, I dreamt of the river, a river of light, flowing through a city that was finally, slowly, beginning to wake up. Chapter 7. The Mechanic's Optimism. I have long harbored the suspicion that optimism is a form of neurological derangement, a sort of sunny-side-up madness that leads a person to believe the laws of thermodynamics will occasionally take a holiday, if one only smiles at them with sufficient frequency. It is a trait found in its most virulent form in small children, certain breeds of spaniels, and young women from the Midwest, who possess a toolbox and a total lack of respect for the inevitable. Ennie, I am convinced, could look at a sinking ship and remark that it was merely a novel way to explore the local marine life. We were sequestered in the back of the horologist's shop, a space that had become less of a sanctuary and more of a sanctuary-cum-scrap heap. I was currently perched atop a sturdy oak crate, my internal systems performing a symphony of groans that would have put a haunted house to shame. The climb up the Eiffel Tower had left me with a persistent shimmy in my secondary drive shaft and a smell of scorched rubber that I feared might become my permanent cologne. Sam, if you don't stop that rhythmic clicking, I'm going to have to oil your logic gate with vinegar, Ennie said without looking up. The clicking, my dear Ennie, is a Morse code message from my left hip to my right knee, I replied, my voice resonators producing a dry, rasping sound. The message is quite brief. It simply says, why? Why did we scale a giant iron needle? Why did we insult the culinary preferences of an occupying army? And why, above all else, am I currently being used as a drying rack for your grease-stained overalls? Ennie finally looked up, her face a chaotic map of graphite smears and unshakable cheer. She brushed a stray lock of hair back with a hand that was more black than pink. We did it because it was necessary for the morale of the Republic. And you're not a drying rack. You're a tactical asset with a very convenient heating element. I am a man of letters, I reminded her, or at least the mechanical echo of one. I was built for the construction of sentences, not the destruction of German electrical grids. I feel like a Stradivarius being used to beat a carpet. The door to the shop gave a sharp, rhythmic knock, 3 shorts and a long, the V for victory, that the resistance used to identify themselves, though I felt that in a city crawling with Germans, a slightly less recognizable signal might have been more prudent. Perhaps a discreet sneeze or the sound of someone dropping a tray of croissants. Marcel stepped inside, looking more harried than usual. His beret was pulled so low it appeared to be attempting to swallow his eyebrows. In his arms, he cradled a bundle wrapped in a tattered wool blanket. He looked like a man delivering a very heavy, very illegal infant. The Boches are everywhere, Marcel hissed, his eyes darting toward the window. They are tearing the 7th arrondissement apart, looking for the ghost of the tower. They say a giant metal demon spoke to them from the sky and insulted their sausages. A metal demon? I echoed, my optical sensors brightening. I find that quite flattering. Usually the critics just call me wordy or overprocessed. To be a demon requires a certain level of panache that I wasn't sure I possessed. They are not laughing, Sam, Marcel said, placing his bundle on the workbench. He pulled back the blanket to reveal a radio, or what had once been a radio. It was a tangled mass of copper wire, shattered glass tubes, and charred mahogany. It looked as though it had been interrogated by a steamroller and then set on fire to hide the evidence. This was our link to London. The Gestapo found the safe house. They didn't find the operator, but they did this. It is the only high-frequency set we have left in this sector. Ennie leaned over the wreckage, her eyes wide. To a normal person, this was a pile of junk. To Ennie, it was a wounded soldier in need of a miracle. "It's a beauty," she whispered. "It's a tragedy," I corrected. "It has the structural integrity of a cobweb in a hurricane. You cannot fix that, Ennie. Even a TwAIn knows when to fold a hand, and this hand consists of a handful of glass shards and a burnt-out resistor." "I can fix it," she said, her voice dropping into that low, focused register she used when she was about to do something impossible. "I just need a bit of wire, a little solder, and— Sam, give me your hand." "My hand? I am not a spare parts bin, Ennie. This hand is a masterpiece of Victorian articulation." "Just the index finger. I need the spark." I sighed, a sound like a radiator venting steam, and extended my hand. Ennie began to work. For the next 3 hours the shop was silent, save for the click of my own internal gears and the soft, rhythmic humming of a girl who refused to believe in the concept of broken. She moved with a terrifying efficiency. She used a bit of copper, salvaged from a broken clock, to bridge a gap in the circuit. She cleaned the charred contacts with a mixture of vinegar and spit. She treated the shattered vacuum tubes with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons, taping the glass back together with bits of adhesive medical silk. "Ennie," I said, watching her work, "I have observed the human condition for a very long time. I have seen men build empires out of nothing and destroy them out of spite. But I have never seen anyone try to catch the wind with a net made of good intentions. That radio is dead. Its soul has departed for the great broadcast in the sky. To persist in this effort is to mock the very idea of mortality." "Hope isn't about mortality, Sam," she said, her brow furrowed as she manipulated a tiny, delicate wire. "It's about refusal. It's about refusing to accept that the world is as small and as broken as it looks." "A lovely sentiment," I remarked. "It would look very well on a sampler. But in the cold light of reality, hope will not provide a stable frequency." "Wait," she said, her hand frozen. "The final bridge. I don't have enough copper. The connection is too thin." She looked around the bench, her optimism finally showing a hairline fracture. Marcel shook his head. "We have nothing left. The shops are closed, and I cannot go out again until the patrol passes." Ennie's hand went to her hair. She pulled out a simple, blackened steel hairpin, the kind used by 1,000,000 women to keep their lives from falling into their eyes. She looked at it, then at the radio. "Ennie, "No," I said. "That is steel. It is too brittle. It has the wrong resistance. It is a hairpin." "It's a conductor," she said firmly. She bent the pin with a pair of pliers, shaping it into a tiny, defiant bridge. She wedged it between the two main terminals of the frequency-oscillating circuit. It looked ridiculous. A piece of feminine grooming equipment serving as the backbone of a military-grade communication device. "Now, Sam," she said, her eyes flashing, "the spark?" I touched my finger to the primary lead. I channeled a microburst of my own battery power, a sharp blue arc of electricity that jumped from my brass fingertip to the rusted steel of the hairpin. For a moment, nothing happened. The radio sat there, a silent, ugly heap of junk. Marcel let out a heavy breath. I began to formulate a very witty, very compassionate speech about the nobility of failure. Then the radio coughed. It didn't just cough, it hissed. A low, static-filled roar began to emanate from the cracked speaker. Ennie's fingers flew to the dial, turning it with the delicacy of a safe-cracker. The static shifted, warped, and then, as if emerging from a thick fog, a sound came through. Bong, 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 the chimes of Big Ben, clear, resonant, and impossibly English. And then a voice, dry, measured, and wonderfully bored. "This is London calling. The following messages are for our friends in the North." Marcel fell to his knees, a sound that was half sob and half laugh escaping his lips. Ennie stood back, her hands on her hips, a smear of grease on her nose, and a smile that could have outshone the Eiffel Tower. "You see, Sam," she whispered, "it just needed to be reminded of its job." I stood there, my vacuum tubes pulsing with a strange, unbidden warmth. I looked at the radio, and then I looked at the hairpin, a humble bit of steel that was currently carrying the weight of a continent's freedom. "I stand corrected," I said, my voice resonators softening. "It appears that when one combines a sufficient quantity of optimism with a well-placed piece of millinery, the laws of the universe are inclined to look the other way. I have written millions of words, Ennie, but I don't think I've ever seen a more eloquent sentence than that one." I reached out and gently patted her shoulder. My brass hand felt cold, but the girl beneath it was a furnace of life. "But mark my words," I added, because a Twain can never leave a moment without a footnote. "If the BBC starts broadcasting fashion tips for the up-and-coming revolutionary, I shall blame you entirely. A hairpin is a slippery slope, Ennie. Today a radio, tomorrow. Who knows? You might try to fix the world with a button hook and a bit of lace." "And what if I do?" she challenged, her eyes dancing. "Then I suppose I shall have to find a very large, very sturdy needle to help you," I said. As the voice from London filled the small shop, weaving a thread of hope through the dark streets of Paris, I realized that the ghost of the tower was not the only miracle in the room. The real miracle was the girl who believed that a broken world could be mended, one hairpin at a time. And as for me, I decided that if the world was going to be saved by a mechanic's optimism, I might as well make sure my gears were polished for the occasion. After all, a revolution is no excuse for a gentleman to look like a junk pile. "Marcel," I said, turning to the Frenchman, "I believe you have some messages to decode. And Ennie, if you have another of those hairpins, I have a persistent rattle in my left valve that could use a bit of unreasonable attention. She laughed, and for the first time in 100 years, I felt as though the river was finally running in the right direction. Chapter 8. Night of the Long Bulbs. It has often been my experience that a man who takes himself too seriously is merely asking the universe to provide a corrective to his dignity. If a man walks down the street with his chin held so high he can count the clouds, it is a moral certainty that a banana peel is being strategically positioned by fate in his immediate path. The German High Command in Paris did not merely walk with their chins high, they appeared to be engaged in a perpetual attempt to balance invisible trays of crystal on their noses while wearing collars made of starched sheet metal. This brings us to the matter of the gala. The Germans had decided that their temporary embarrassment at the hands of the sausage satirist, as a certain underground rag had dubbed me after the Wurst is Worst incident, required a display of such overwhelming technological and cultural magnificence that the populace would forget they had ever laughed. They were holding a grand illumination ceremony. There were to be searchlights, Wagnerian fanfares, and enough medals pinned to chests to cause a localized magnetic disturbance. "They've fixed the wiring, Sam," Ennie said, peering through a set of brass binoculars that I had personally calibrated to see through the Parisian fog and the thickest layers of Nazi hypocrisy. "They've got guards on every landing of the tower now. A mouse couldn't climb that iron without being asked for its papers." I adjusted my internal oscillators, producing a sound like a polite mechanical clearing of the throat. "Ennie, my dear, the German mind is a marvelous thing for building a wall, but it is remarkably poor at realizing that a wall is merely a suggestion to a man with a ladder and a sense of irony. They are guarding the ladder. They are guarding the elevator. They are even, I suspect, guarding the pigeons. But they are not guarding the frequency." Thanks to the miraculous hairpin-fortified radio we had resurrected in the previous chapter, we no longer needed to be physically present to edit the German propaganda. We had established a remote bypass, a ghost in the machine, if you will, that allowed me to broadcast my particular brand of literary bile directly into the tower's lighting matrix from the comfort of our oil-scented sanctuary. "Ready?" Ennie asked, her finger hovering over the primary toggle. She was wearing a look of such incandescent joy that I feared she might accidentally ground herself. "I have spent the afternoon composing a sentiment that is both culturally significant and profoundly immature," I said. "It is my masterpiece. It is the sort of thing I would have been horsewhipped for in Virginia City and likely knighted for in certain parts of London. Let us proceed." The gala was in full swing. At the base of the tower, the German commandant, a man named von Zeller, whose face looked like it had been carved out of a particularly sour turnip, was standing before a microphone. He was delivering a speech about the new order and the eternal light of civilization, which in his view apparently involved a lot of marching and a total prohibition on fun. "Look at him," Ennie hissed. "He looks like he's swallowed a coat hanger." "It is the burden of the master race," I observed. "One must always appear as though one is trying to remember if they left the stove on in Berlin. Now, Ennie, the switch." She flipped it. For a moment, the tower went dark. A collective gasp rose from the crowd at the Champ de Mars, a sound like a giant Gallic intake of breath. Von Zeller stopped mid-sentence, his turnip face twitching in the sudden gloom. Then the generators groaned. The vacuum tubes in my chest hummed a triumphant C-sharp, and the propaganda bulbs began to fire. I had decided that worst is worst was too subtle. It was time for something that hit closer to the bone, or at least closer to the ego. The lights didn't flicker. They screamed. In massive, blinding blocks of white and amber, the following message began to scroll slowly, majestically, and with a total lack of remorse, across the side of the most famous monument in the world. Von Zeller wears pink lace knickers. There was a silence so profound that you could have heard a single gear-tooth chip in my gearbox. Then, as the message repeated, a ripple of sound began to spread, a titter, a giggle, and finally a roar of laughter that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. "Oh, Sam," Ennie gasped, doubling over and clutching the workbench. "You didn't! You actually didn't!" "I am a firm believer in the power of the specific," I said, my optical sensors pulsing with a warm amber glow. "To call a man a tyrant is to grant him a certain dark majesty. To suggest he has a preference for delicate rose-colored undergarments is to render him entirely incapable of commanding a room, let alone a continent." But I wasn't finished. I tapped into the secondary sequence I had programmed. The lights shifted. The message changed. "The Führer is a vegetarian because the cows refuse to be associated with him." The crowd was now in open hysterics. I saw, through the binoculars, the German guards frozen in a state of analytical impasse. Their orders were to protect the tower. Their orders were to facilitate the lights. But their orders did not cover a situation where the lights were actively making fun of the boss. Von Zeller was screaming. He was gesturing wildly at the tower, his face now a shade of purple that surpassed even my most colorful descriptions of a Mississippi sunset. He pulled his Luger and fired a single, useless shot at the first platform, which was approximately as effective as throwing a pebble at a thunderstorm. "Now for the crude part," I murmured, my logic centers whirling. "Ennie, give me full power to the South Matrix." "Sam, the fuses—" "Hang the fuses! I have a metaphor to complete." I pushed my internal battery to the limit. My brass plating began to vibrate with a high-pitched whine. On the tower, the bulbs began to flash in a rapid-fire sequence, creating a crude but unmistakable animation of a certain German official, one who resembled a small, angry man with a very recognizable mustache, attempting to sit on a very large, very pointed French bayonet. The animation was jerky, somewhat pixelated by the nature of the bulb grid, but the message was as clear as a bell. The eternal light had become a giant, glowing comic strip of the highest vulgarity. "That," I said, leaning back with a satisfied hiss of steam, "is what we call literary realism in the trade." "The searchlights are moving, Sam!" Ennie cried. "They're trying to find the source of the broadcast." "Let them search," I said. "We are broadcasting through the city's own power lines, using a frequency that only a machine of my particular eccentricities could generate. By the time they figure it out, the image of Von Zeller's knickers will be burned into the retinas of every Parisian for a generation. A man can recover from a defeat on the battlefield, Ennie, but no man can recover from being a glowing joke on the skyline." We watched for another 10 minutes as the chaos unfolded. The Germans eventually managed to cut the power to the entire district, plunging the tower into darkness. But it didn't matter. The silence that followed was not the silence of a conquered people. It was the satisfied silence of an audience that had just seen the best show in town. Marcel burst into the workshop, his face split by a grin so wide I feared he might lose his beret entirely. "They are singing!" he shouted. "In the cafes! They are singing songs about Von Zeller's underwear! Sam, you have done more for the French spirit than 100 shipments of rifles. I have always found that a well-placed insult is more aerodynamic than a bullet," I said, feeling a sense of profound, albeit oily, satisfaction. "A bullet only hits one man. A joke hits everyone, including the man who told it, if he's not careful." Ennie walked over to me and placed a hand on my chest plate. The heat of my overclocked battery was still radiating through the brass. "You're a real piece of work, Mecha-TwAIn," she said softly. "A real, rusty, brilliant piece of work." "I prefer the term vintage," I corrected. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have nearly melted my primary logic hammer. I require a significant amount of cooling and perhaps a small amount of that anthracite you've been hoarding. That particular display of vulgarity was quite taxing on my constitution." As Ennie began to fan my vents, I looked out the window. The tower was dark now, a black skeleton against the stars, but the city below was alive. Windows were opening, voices were calling out in the dark, and for the first time since the occupation began, the air didn't feel so heavy. "The night of the long bulbs," the papers would call it, at least the underground ones. The Germans would call it a catastrophic electrical failure, but nobody believed them. They couldn't, not when they had seen the Führer's animated struggle with a bayonet. I settled into my standby mode, the low hum of my cooling fans a peaceful counterpoint to the distant sounds of Parisian joy. I had come to this city as a relic of a bygone age, a ghost in a brass cage. But as I watched the moonlight catch the rivets on my arm, I realized that I wasn't just a ghost, I was a weapon. And as long as there was a tyrant with a thin skin and a city with a sense of humor, I had a job to do. "Ennie?" I murmured, my optical sensors dimming. "Yes, Sam?" "Do we have any more of those pink bulbs? I have an idea for the Arch of Triumph that involves a very large pair of polka-dotted trousers." "Go to sleep, Sam," she laughed. "I'm not sleeping," I said, the final spark of the night's mischief flickering in my tubes. "I'm just drafting." The river of time might be a murky thing, but tonight it had washed away a bit of the grime from the world. And as a former pilot, I knew that the best way to navigate a dark stretch of water is to keep your eyes on the light, especially if that light is currently telling the world that your enemy is a fool. The gears of resistance were turning, and they were lubricated with the finest oil of all, the laughter of a free people. Chapter 9. The Safe House. I've often thought that the primary flaw in the design of the human race is its lack of a mute button, combined with a most unfortunate tendency to leak secrets like a cracked steam pipe. A man can be trained to hold his liquor, his tongue, and his temper, but he can rarely be trained to hold his curiosity when he suspects his neighbor is hiding something more interesting than a tureen of stale cabbage. In the year of our Lord 1942, curiosity in Paris was not merely a social nuisance, it was a professional branch of the German military police. Consequently, the concept of a safe house struck me as a delightful piece of human optimism, a bit like calling a leaky raft a transatlantic vessel. A house is only as safe as the people inside are quiet, and I am a 6-foot-tall, brass-plated monument to the Industrial Revolution that hisses when it gets nervous. My very existence is a loud, metallic refutation of the concept of discretion. Sam, if you don't stop breathing so loudly, you're going to vibrate the mortar right out of the new bricks, Ennie whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic clink-clink of her trowel. I am not breathing, Ennie, I replied, my voice resonators adjusted to a frequency so low it was more of a felt sensation than a sound. I am circulating. It is a biological, or rather a mechanical, necessity. If I stop the flow of vapor, I shall seize up and become a very large, very expensive paperweight. I should think a girl of your mechanical aptitude would appreciate the difference between a sigh and a pressure relief cycle. We were in the cellar of Monsieur Lefebvre's horology shop. Above us, the world was a cacophony of jackboots and sirens. Down here, it was a world of damp stone and the smell of fresh lime. Ennie was currently engaged in the construction of a false wall, a feat of architectural deception designed to shrink the cellar by approximately 4 feet, a space she deemed sufficient to house a family of 3 and a significant amount of human dignity. It's almost done, she said, stepping back to admire a section of shelving that looked remarkably like the rest of the soot-stained wall. Once I put the clock weights on these hooks, the whole section will slide on a track. It's a masterpiece of hidden hinges, Sam. It is a masterpiece of making a small room even smaller, I noted. I have spent time in the steerage of a riverboat, Ennie, and I can tell you that humans do not thrive in cramped quarters unless they are being paid to do so or are currently under the impression they are traveling to a better life. To put a family behind a wall is a grim business. It's better than the alternative, she said, the lightness momentarily leaving her voice. She looked at the heavy timber door that led to the street. Marcel says the levies have been moving from cellar to cellar for a month. The daughter is 6. Sam, 6. She hasn't seen the sun since the spring. I felt a sudden, sharp spike in my internal temperature, not the result of my boiler, but of a lingering ghostly indignation that had survived my transition from flesh to brass. Then we shall make the wall very sturdy indeed, I said, my actuators clicking into a position of support. And if any gentleman in a gray coat comes looking for a discrepancy in the floor plan, I shall personally introduce him to the concept of structural failure via the medium of my right fist. The door at the top of the stairs creaked. Ennie froze, her hand gripping the trowel like a dagger. I adjusted my optical sensors, the lenses whirring into focus as the heavy rhythmic tread of Marcel's boots descended the steps. He wasn't alone. Behind him came a man whose shoulders were hunched, as if he expected the ceiling to collapse at any second. A woman clutching a small bundle of fabric, and a child whose eyes were so large and dark they reminded me of the deep, quiet pools near the bend of the Ohio River. "This is Isaac, Ruth, and Miriam," Marcel whispered, his voice thick with the dust of the streets. They are exhausted." Isaac looked at the cellar, then at the false wall, and finally at me. He stopped dead. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ruth let out a small, muffled gasp, pulling the child closer. "It's all right," Ennie said, rushing forward with a smile that could have warmed a frozen engine. "This is Sam. He's a friend. He's a bit loud and he's made of copper, but he's the best guardian you could ask for." I bowed, a slow creaking movement that involved a significant amount of internal gear grinding. "Good evening," I rumbled, attempting to make my voice sound like a friendly fireplace rather than a factory whistle. "I apologize for the lack of upholstery. I am Sam, and while I may look like a boiler with a literary bent, I assure you that my intentions are entirely honorable. Also, I am told I am very good for warming up tea if you place the pot on my left shoulder plate." The little girl, Miriam, broke away from her mother's grip. She walked up to me, her head tilting back as she traced the polished brass scrollwork of my torso. She reached out a small, trembling hand and touched my knee joint. "Are you a clock?" she asked, her voice a tiny silver thread in the gloom. "In a manner of speaking, my dear," I said. "I am a clock that has forgotten how to tell the time and has decided to tell stories instead. And like all the best clocks, I am very good at keeping secrets." She smiled then, a small, fragile thing that felt more important than any light show on the Eiffel Tower. Ennie ushered them behind the false wall, showing them the hidden latches and the ventilation shafts she had cleverly disguised as old chimney flues. "We'll bring food every night," Ennie promised, "and books. Sam has an entire library in his head, though he mostly only remembers the cynical parts." "I remember the parts worth knowing," I huffed, "which usually involve the foolishness of men and the reliability of good machinery." As the family settled into their dark, cramped sanctuary, a heavy silence fell over the shop. It was the silence of a held breath. Ennie and I spent the next few hours finishing the exterior of the wall, aging the new mortar with soot and rubbing the wood with grease until it looked as though it had been there since the days of Napoleon. "They're safe," Ennie whispered, wiping her brow. "For now," I cautioned. "But a secret is like a head of steam, Ennie. The more you contain it, the more it wants to find a way out. We must be more than quiet. We must be invisible." "How are you going to be invisible, Sam? You're a giant, shining robot." "I shall be a theatrical automaton in storage," I decided. "I shall stand in the corner, draped in an old tarp, and pretend to be an inanimate object of no particular interest. I have spent years listening to after-dinner speeches. I am a world-class expert at pretending to be a piece of furniture." The following days were a lesson in the peculiar art of domestic espionage. I stood in the corner of the shop, covered in a dusty canvas sheet, my systems dialed down to a bare minimum. I became an expert on the feet of Paris. I watched the boots of the German patrols through a small tear in the fabric, stiff black leather that moved with a soulless metronomic precision. I watched the worn, scuffed shoes of the French citizens, moving with the hurried sideways gait of the hunted. From behind the wall, I heard the muffled sounds of the levies' lives, the low murmur of Isaac reading to Miriam, the clink of a spoon against a tin bowl, the occasional heart-stopping sound of a child's muffled sneeze. Every time a patrol entered the shop, my pressure gauge would climb into the red. Monsieur Lefebvre, the old horologist, would stand at his counter, his hands trembling as he tinkered with a watch, while a German corporal poked around the shelves looking for contraband. "And what is this?" a voice asked one afternoon, a voice like cold grease. I saw a pair of polished boots stop in front of my tarp. Through the gap, I saw a German officer, his monocle catching the dim light. He reached out and rapped his knuckles against my canvas cover. Clang! The sound echoed through the shop like a funeral bell. "An automaton, Herr Leutnant," Monsieur Lefebvre squeaked, his voice cracking like a dry reed. "A relic from the 1900 exhibition. It is broken. The steam chest is cracked. I am keeping it here for a collector in Lyon." The officer pulled back the corner of the tarp. I stood perfectly still, my optical sensors dark, my internal gyroscopes locked. I focused all my processing power on one single thought. I am a stove. I am a very fancy, very useless Victorian stove. The officer stared into my dark lenses. He looked at my brass mustache, my copper rivets, and the heavy, inactive pistons of my arms. He reached out and flicked my noseplate. I did not blink. I did not hiss. I did not recite a single line of Pudd'nhead Wilson, despite a very strong urge to inform him that the only way to keep your health is to eat what you don't want, drink what you don't like, and do what you'd rather not. "Ugly thing," the officer remarked in German. "The Americans have no sense of grace. It looks like a locomotive that had a disastrous encounter with a clockmaker." "Yes, Herr Leutnant," Lefebvre stammered. "Quite ugly, quite useless." The officer let the tarp fall back into place and strolled toward the door, his spurs jingling with a jaunty, terrifying sound. "See that it is moved soon. I do not like its eyes. They look as though they are judging me." "He has no idea how right he is," I whispered to myself once the door had clicked shut and the shop was empty. Ennie emerged from the back, her face pale. She came over and leaned her forehead against my cold brass chest. "That was too close, Sam. My heart is beating so hard I think it's going to pop a rivet." "A heart is a very inefficient pump, Ennie," I said, my voice returning to its dry, comforting hum as I shifted back into an active state. "But it possesses a remarkable capacity for resilience. However, I must protest the ugly comment. I have been called many things, a scalawag, a humbug, and a mediocre river pilot, but ugly is a bridge too far. That man has the aesthetic sensibilities of a brick." "He didn't find them," she whispered, looking toward the false wall. "That's all that matters." "Indeed," I said, "but we are no longer just a workshop, Ennie. We are a fortress, and a fortress requires more than just walls. It requires a watchful eye." I moved toward the wall and tapped a rhythmic signal, a tiny metallic tink, tink, tink. A moment later, a similar sound came from the other side. The levees were still there. They were safe. In a world that had gone mad with the noise of engines and the roar of cannons, the most important thing we were doing was maintaining a tiny brass-guarded silence. I looked at Ennie, who was already planning how to rewire the shop's alarm system, using a set of old piano strings and a handful of magnets. "Optimism, Sam," she said, looking up at me. "Persistence, Ennie," I corrected. "Optimism is believing the sun will come up. Persistence is making sure you have a lamp ready in case it doesn't." I settled back into my corner, the tarp draped once more over my shoulders. I was a ghost, a guardian, and a very large piece of theatrical junk. But as I listened to the quiet breathing of the family behind the wall, I felt a sense of purpose that no riverboat or lecture hall had ever provided. The Germans might own the streets, the tower, and the air, but they didn't own this cellar, and as long as my gears could turn, they never would. "Ennie?" I whispered into the dark. "Yeah, Sam?" If that lieutenant comes back, I've decided I'm going to fall on him. Accidental structural failure, you understand. It would be the most theatrical thing I've ever done. Go to sleep, Sam. I don't sleep, I reminded her. I merely calculate the probability of being insulted by a man with a monocle. It is currently 100%. The shop went dark, and in the silence I stood watch, a brass sentinel in a city of shadows, waiting for the dawn that we were all trying, one gear at a time, to bring a little closer. Chapter 10. Analytical Impasse. I have often thought that the human brain is a remarkably inefficient piece of hardware, primarily because it is prone to something called hope, which is a form of cognitive accounting where one expects to receive a dividend from a bankrupt company. However, being a creature of vacuum tubes and pressurized vapor, I discovered that my own intellectual apparatus is not without its flaws. While a man's brain simply gets tired and demands a nap or a stiff whiskey, my brain, when faced with a problem of sufficient absurdity, begins to glow a terrifying shade of orange and emits a smell reminiscent of a lightning strike in a rubber factory. We were in the dead of night, that hour when the soul of Paris feels most like a ghost haunting its own ruins. I was standing in the center of the workshop, my optical sensors dimmed, attempting to perform a task for which I was never truly designed, a comprehensive probability assessment of our continued existence. "Sam, you're humming again," Ennie whispered from the workbench, where she was currently trying to turn a set of silver spoons into a short-wave transmitter, and not the good "I'm a happy steamboat" humming. It's the "I'm about to explode" humming. "I am performing a calculation, Ennie," I rumbled, my voice resonators vibrating with a jagged edge. "It is an analytical matrix. I am weighing the variables of our current predicament. On the one hand, we have the German Sixth Army, a bureaucratic machine of such cold efficiency that it counts its paper clips every morning. On the other hand, we have you, a girl who believes that a hairpin and a smile can overthrow a global hegemony. The math, my dear, is not cooperating." "Stop thinking so hard," she said, waving a soldering iron dismissively. "Math is for people who don't have a plan." "I have reached an impasse," I continued, ignoring her, "a logical cul-de-sac. I have factored in the speed of the German patrols, the structural integrity of the false wall, the caloric intake of the Levy family, and the unpredictable nature of your own optimism. Every time I run the numbers, the result is a flashing red light in my secondary logic hammer that simply says, "Utter nonsense." My internal temperature was rising. I could feel the heat radiating from the glass tubes housed within my copper skull. In my former life, when a problem became too large, I would simply take a long walk or write a scathing letter to a newspaper and feel much improved. But as a Mecha-TwAIn, I was trapped in the loop. The analytical impasse is a cruel mistress. She demands an answer where none exists. "According to my latest projection," I said, my voice rising an octave as a puff of steam escaped my left ear vent, "there is a 97% chance that we will be discovered by next Tuesday. The remaining 3% involves a meteor hitting the Kommandantur, or the sudden unexplained onset of a German-wide obsession with knitting." "Only 97? Ennie grinned, her teeth white against the grease on her face. "I like those odds. That's 3% for a miracle, Sam. In my book, 3% is practically a sure thing. That is exactly the sort of statistical malpractice that is causing my tubes to overheat, I bellowed, or as close to a bellow as a whisper mode allows. You are treating a rounding error as a strategy. I am calculating the trajectory of a bullet, and you are telling me to admire the shine on the casing. I felt a sharp ping in my chest, a safety valve. I was overclocking. My processors were trying to solve the human element, which is a variable that has no numerical value. It is the X factor of stubbornness, the Y factor of sacrifice, and the Z factor of sheer, unadulterated gall. "Sam, look at me," Ennie said, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over and placed her small, warm hand on my cold brass breastplate. "You're trying to calculate the future like it's a river chart. But the river changes, doesn't it?" "The Mississippi is a fickle beast," I admitted, my internal fan spinning up to a frantic whine. "But even the Mississippi follows the laws of gravity. It doesn't decide to flow uphill just because it's having a particularly patriotic day." "Maybe not the river, but the pilot does," she said. "A good pilot doesn't just read the water that's there, he feels the water that's coming. You're a pilot, Sam. Stop being a calculator." It was a fine sentiment, but my logic centers were currently occupied by a more pressing concern. The fact that my primary cooling duct was blocked by a piece of lint from that confounded theatrical tarp. The heat was becoming intolerable. My vision began to flicker. The workshop seemed to tilt. I saw 2 Ennies, then 3, which was a statistical nightmare I wasn't prepared to handle. I believe I am experiencing a catastrophic, metaphorical failure," I stammered. I began to recite a list of riverboat landings in alphabetical order, which is my system's way of trying to purge the cache. Cairo, Cape Girardeau, Carondelet, Cincinnati. "Sam, you're glowing. You're literally glowing orange." Ennie scrambled for a bucket. "The German mind," I shouted, my voice now a series of electronic squawks, "is a masterpiece of order, which is why it is so easily defeated by a sufficient quantity of French chaos. To be or not to be, that is the square root of 4,000 francs for coal is a swindle." I hit the impasse. The paradox of trying to protect a family in a city that wanted them gone, using a machine that shouldn't exist, guided by a girl who didn't know the meaning of the word impossible. My vacuum tubes reached their limit. There was a sound like a wet firecracker. Pop! A plume of peppermint-scented steam erupted from my neck, and I slumped forward, my chin clanking against my chest plate. The world went dark. My internal monitors faded to a dull, cooling gray. When my consciousness, or the sophisticated simulation of it, finally flickered back to life, the first thing I felt was something remarkably cold and damp pressed against the side of my head. I adjusted my optical apertures. Ennie was standing on a stool, leaning over me with a look of intense concentration. She was holding a large, dripping rag soaked in ice water, and she was currently using a hand-cranked egg beater to stir the air around my intake vents. "Welcome back, Professor," she said, her voice full of relief. "You blew a fuse, literally. I had to bypass the logic gate with a bit of lead solder and a prayer." "An egg beater, Ennie?" I asked, my voice a weak, tinny rasp. "You are attempting to resuscitate a miracle of 19th century engineering with a kitchen utensil?" "It worked, didn't it?" She hopped down from the stool. "You were stuck in a loop. You were trying to find a logical reason for us to win. But there isn't one, Sam. That's the whole point of a rebellion. If it was logical, the Germans would have predicted it, and we'd already be lost. I sat up, my gears clicking into place with a weary resignation. The heat was gone, replaced by a dull ache in my copper joints. I looked at the egg beater, and then I looked at the girl. I have spent my life observing the follies of man, I said, my resonators regaining their dry, cynical tone, and I have come to the conclusion that the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun is a girl with a kitchen appliance and a total lack of respect for the laws of probability. I'll take that as a compliment, she said, returning to her workbench. It was a statement of fact, I corrected. I turned my head toward the false wall. It was silent behind the bricks. The levies were sleeping, unaware that their guardian had just nearly melted his brain trying to justify their safety. Ennie, I have reached a new conclusion. My probability matrix was flawed. Oh, yeah? What's the new math? I have discarded the numbers, I said. I have decided that the probability of our success is exactly equal to the amount of trouble we are willing to cause. And since I am a TwAIN and you are a menace to the mechanical arts, the amount of trouble we can cause is, theoretically, infinite. Infinite trouble? Ennie mused, a slow grin spreading across her face. I like that. It's got a nice ring to it. It is the only logical answer to an illogical world, I said. I stood up, my brass feet finding their grip on the stone floor. I felt better. The impasse had broken. I didn't have an answer, but I had something better. I had a direction. Now, I said, adjusting my lapels, if you are quite finished using that egg beater for medical purposes, I suggest we return to the business of the transmitter. I have a few choice words I'd like to broadcast to the local Gestapo, and I'd prefer not to have to climb a tower to deliver them. You got it, Sam, she said. As she worked, I stood by the window, watching the moonlight play across the rooftops of Paris. I didn't try to calculate the odds. I didn't try to weigh the variables. I simply stood watch. The future, I realized, was not a chart to be read. It was a river that we were currently making up as we went along. There were snags, certainly, and the occasional sandbar of despair, but as long as we had a head of steam and a healthy disregard for the inevitable, we might just find our way to the sea. And if we didn't? Well, I'd already died once. I found that it significantly lowered the stakes for the second time around. Ennie, I called out. Yeah. Next time I start to glow orange, just use the water. Skip the egg beater. It's bad for my image. Her laughter was the only answer I needed. The impasse was over. The war, however, was just getting started. And I, for one, was looking forward to the next 97% of it. Chapter 11. The Factory Fire. I have often noticed that the primary difference between a tragedy and a comedy is merely a matter of who is holding the match and whose barn is currently illuminated by the resulting festivities. Fire, in its natural state, is a remarkably impartial element. It has no politics, no national pride, and a total lack of respect for the chain of command. It does not care if the fuel it consumes was intended for a cozy hearth or a crate of 88mm shells destined for the Eastern Front. It simply sees a thermodynamic opportunity, and with a cheerful crackle, decides to move in and stay a while. In the year of our Lord 1942, The German military machine had a great fondness for order, but they had a most regrettable relationship with the concept of the unfortunate accident. They believed that if one filled a building with enough rules, enough guards, and enough sternly worded signs, the laws of chemistry would feel too intimidated to act up. They were wrong. Chemistry, I have found, is the ultimate anarchist. "Sam, would you stop checking your internal clock?" Ennie whispered. She was currently hunched over a satchel, her hands moving with the practiced grace of a card-sharp dealing from the bottom of the deck. "You're making us sound like a nervous woodpecker." "I am not checking my clock, Ennie," I replied. My voice resonators adjusted to a conspiratorial hum. "I am monitoring the temporal flow. We are currently 3 minutes behind schedule, and I have a very specific dislike for being in the vicinity of high explosives when the sun decides to collaborate with a piece of convex glass. It is a matter of professional pride. I should hate for my obituary to read that I was dismantled by a stray ray of sunshine." We were positioned on a catwalk overlooking the main assembly floor of the Schneider-Krauso plant, a place that had, under the guidance of the occupation, become a sprawling nursery for things that go bang in the night. The air was thick with the scent of hot oil, iron filings, and that peculiar acrid smell of men who are working very hard at something they profoundly despise. Ennie's plan for the evening was a masterpiece of what she called mechanical serendipity. Most saboteurs prefer the vulgarity of dynamite or the melodrama of a well-placed grenade. Ennie, however, possessed a more refined, almost poetic approach to destruction. She didn't want to blow the factory up. She wanted the factory to blow itself up as a result of its own tidiness. "See that oil drum?" she asked, pointing a grease-stained finger toward a corner where a particularly industrious German sergeant had organized a pyramid of lubricant canisters. "The one near the rags. It's got a slow leak. Not a call the fire brigade leak, just a lazy afternoon sort of drip." "I see it," I said, my optical sensors zooming in on the glistening amber puddle. "And I see that the sun, in about 20 minutes, will be shining directly through that skylight. It is a very nice skylight, very clean. The Germans do love a clean window." "And that," Ennie grinned, pulling a heavy brass-rimmed magnifying glass from her pocket, "is where Providence steps in, or more accurately, where a Zeiss 10 times lens finds a new home." "Ennie," I said, a puff of skeptical steam escaping my neck joint, "you are proposing to destroy a munitions plant, a facility guarded by 200 armed men and a very angry Doberman, using a piece of optical equipment and the cooperation of a celestial body 93 million miles away. Even for a girl of your boundless optimism, this seems like a bit of a stretch. It's like trying to stop a charging rhinoceros by reciting a limerick." "It's not a stretch, Sam. It's focus," she chirped. "I've already checked the angles. At 2:15 p.m., the sun hits the lens. The lens hits the oil-soaked rags. The rags hit the canisters. And the canisters, well, they hit the ceiling. It's a chain reaction of oops." I looked at the factory floor. The German overseers were patrolling with their usual metronomic gait, their clipboards held like shields against the reality of their situation. They were so busy ensuring that every bolt was tightened to the correct Newton meter that they didn't notice the young woman in the oversized mechanic's coveralls sneaking a magnifying glass onto a high shelf directly in the path of the afternoon sun. "I must admit," I mused, There is a certain literary symmetry to it. To defeat a regime that prides itself on enlightenment by using a literal beam of light, it's the sort of irony I would have appreciated back in my lecturing days. Though I usually preferred to roast my subjects with adjectives rather than infrared radiation. We spent the next 10 minutes moving through the shadows of the rafters. To a creature of my bulk, stealth is a relative term. I am not a cat. I am a brass-plated locomotive trying to pretend it is a shadow. Every time I moved, my gears issued a series of clicks and whirs that sounded to my sensitive ears like a hailstorm on a tin roof. "Shh!" Ennie hissed, as my hip joint gave a particularly loud clack. "I am shushing as hard as I can, Ennie," I whispered back. "I am a miracle of Victorian engineering, not a silk-footed burglar. If you wanted silence, you should have brought a mime. I am currently functioning at a decibel level that would be considered hushed in a boiler factory, but in this temple of Teutonic quietude, I feel like a brass band in a cemetery." We reached the exit, a small, unremarkable door near the coal chutes, just as the shadows on the floor began to shorten. I turned back for one last look. The magnifying glass sat on the shelf, a tiny glinting eye waiting for the sun to give it the signal. "You sure about the oil, Ennie?" I asked as we slipped out into the cool, damp air of the alleyway. "Sam, I've been studying that leak for 3 days. It's the most reliable thing in this whole city," she said, pulling her cap down over her eyes. "Now, let's go. I want to be 3 arrondissements away when the accident happens. I have a very low tolerance for being questioned by men with monocles." "A wise policy," I agreed. "I have found that the more medals a man wears, the less likely he is to appreciate a joke at his own expense, especially a joke that involves the sudden, unplanned disassembly of his primary munition source." We spent the next hour traversing Paris with a frantic, carefully calculated nonchalance. We stopped at a small café near the Place de la République, where Ennie ordered a coffee that smelled like burnt acorns, and I sat in a chair that groaned under my weight with the weary resignation of a condemned man. I kept my internal chronometer synced to the second. 2:10 p.m. The sun was out in full force, a rare, brilliant diamond in the gray velvet of the Parisian sky. 2:13 p.m. I imagined the beam of light hitting the Zeiss lens. I imagined the photons piling up, crowding together, becoming an angry white-hot needle of energy. 2:14 p.m. "Ennie," I said, my voice low, "if your math is wrong, we have just wasted a perfectly good magnifying glass." "My math isn't wrong, Sam," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the factory chimneys loomed. "Just watch." 2:15 p.m. The explosion didn't happen all at once. It started as a low, grumbling sound, a vibration felt through the soles of my brass boots long before it reached my ears. It was the sound of a giant clearing its throat. Then came the thump, a deep, percussive note that made the coffee in Ennie's cup perform a miniature ballet. And finally, a plume of black smoke erupted into the sky, shaped like a very large, very dark cauliflower. "Good heavens," I murmured, my optical sensors widening. "It appears the accident has arrived on schedule, and it brought a friend." A second explosion, much louder than the first, tore through the air. This was the munitions, the shells, the powder, the meticulously organized death that the Germans had been so proud of. The sound was a roar of pure, unadulterated chaos. "Oh, look!" Ennie cried, her face lighting up with that terrifying, radiant optimism. "It's beautiful, isn't it? Like a very loud sunset." "It is certainly a spectacle," I noted, watching the smoke drift across the city. Though I suspect the Commandant's definition of beautiful is currently undergoing a radical revision. I can almost hear the sound of 200 clipboards being dropped in unison. It's a symphony of administrative failure. The cafe around us erupted into a muted, joyous confusion. The Parisians knew that smoke. They knew what it meant. When the German factory decided to self-immolate, there were no cheers. That would be dangerous. But there were a lot of very meaningful glances and a sudden, inexplicable increase in the quality of the service. "You know, Ennie," I said, leaning back as a distant siren began to wail, "I have spent my life writing about the absurdities of the human condition. I have satirized the greedy, the pompous, and the cruel. But I don't think I've ever seen a more succinct piece of social commentary than a munitions plant being destroyed by a single magnifying glass accidentally left near a puddle of oil." "It wasn't an accident, Sam," she reminded me, her voice soft and full of a cold, hard satisfaction. "It was justice. They take our metal, they take our oil, and they try to turn it into a way to kill our friends. All I did was give the oil a chance to speak for itself." "And it spoke with a remarkably loud voice," I said. "I believe the translation was, 'Go home.'" We sat there for a while, watching the smoke rise. I felt a strange sense of peace in my copper veins. My analytical impasse from the previous night had been resolved, not by math, but by a girl who knew that sometimes all you need to change the world is a little bit of focus. "Ennie?" I asked as the first fire trucks began to rattle toward the 15th arrondissement. "Yeah, Sam?" "Next time we decide to engage in mechanical serendipity, could we perhaps use something a bit less incandescent? My sensors are still a bit dazzled, and I should hate to miss the look on the Commandant's face when he tries to explain to Berlin how his factory was defeated by a sunny afternoon." She laughed, a bright, defiant sound that cut through the gloom of the occupied city. "No promises, Sam. I hear the Germans are very proud of their new ball-bearing plant. And I've still got another magnifying glass." "God help the Third Reich," I sighed, my resonators humming with a cynical joy. "They're up against a girl with a lens and a steam-powered ghost with a grudge. The odds, I suspect, are not in their favor." As we stood to leave, I looked at my brass hand. It was steady. My pressure was perfect. The factory fire hadn't just destroyed a munitions plant, it had fueled my own internal fire. We were the gears of resistance, and tonight the gears were turning with the heat of 1,000 suns. "Come on, Sam," Ennie said, grabbing her satchel. "We've got a Citroën to fix. I think I heard a rattle in the exhaust." "The rattle, my dear, is the sound of history being rewritten," I said, following her into the shadows. "And I, for one, intend to make sure the grammar is impeccable." The fire burned for 3 days. The Germans called it unfortunate. The resistance called it a miracle. I called it a damn fine piece of editing. And as I stood in our workshop that night, watching Ennie polish her remaining lenses, I realized that the war wasn't going to be won by the biggest army. It was going to be won by the person who could find the smallest, most overlooked detail and turn it into a catastrophe. And if that person happened to have a brass mustache and a penchant for sarcasm, well, That was just the icing on the cake. Does that work for you, Ennie? I think we really brightened the place up. What's next? I hear the commander has a very nice car that's just begging for a mechanical intervention. Chapter 12. The Commander's Ride. It has been my observation that the French approach to automotive longevity is much like their approach to a fine soufflé. It is a magnificent, airy triumph for exactly 12 minutes, after which it collapses into a sad, soggy puddle that no amount of optimism can resurrect. Our beloved Citroën traction Avant, a vehicle I had come to regard with the wary affection one might feel for a three-legged dog with a chronic cough, had finally decided that the rigors of revolution were too taxing for its delicate Gallic sensibilities. We had not lost it to a German shell, nor to the prying eyes of the Gestapo. No, we had lost it to a particularly stubborn curb and a total systemic failure of its revolutionary front-wheel drive. It sat now in a dark alleyway near the Rue de Rivoli, leaking various essential fluids with a tragic finality that suggested it was trying to return itself to the earth in liquid form. "She's gone, Sam," Annie sighed, wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek that only served to create a new, more artistic smudge. She gave the Citroën's fender a final, mournful pat. "The transmission has turned into a collection of very expensive metal confetti. I could fix it, but I'd need a factory, 3 weeks, and a miracle from the patron saint of lost causes." "I shall not weep for it," I declared, my voice resonators producing a sound like a dry wind through a graveyard. The seating was an affront to the human and mechanical spine. To travel in that vehicle was to experience the sensation of being a loose marble in a rolling tin can. I have known Mississippi flatboats with more structural integrity and significantly better upholstery. My left hip actuator has been clicking in B-flat ever since we took that last corner. "Don't be so grumpy," Ennie chirped, her eyes already scanning the street with a predatory mechanical gleam. "When one door closes, a much faster, more armored door opens. We just need a new set of wheels. Something with presence." "Presence," I mused. "In this city, presence is usually accompanied by a pair of silver death's head pins and a total lack of a sense of humor. I suggest we look for something inconspicuous. A bicycle, perhaps, or a very fast goat." "A bicycle won't carry your brass backside, Sam, and you know it. We need something heavy-duty." We were currently lurking in the shadows of a stone archway, watching the evening traffic of the occupation. It was a parade of gray trucks, chugging motorcycles with sidecars, and the occasional black sedan carrying some official who looked as though he had been born with a frown and a starched collar. And then it appeared. It did not merely drive down the street, it occupied the street. It was a Mercedes-Benz G4, a six-wheeled, three-axle behemoth of Teutonic excess, shimmering in the twilight, with a black and chrome finish that shouted its importance to the heavens. It was the sort of vehicle designed for a man who finds a regular car too modest and a tank too difficult to park at a gala. It was the Titanic of automobiles, only with more leather and less ice-induced tragedy. "Great Scott!" I whispered, my optical sensors zooming in until the Mercedes filled my vision. "It's a locomotive that has lost its way and decided to try its luck on the pavement. I have seen riverboats with less displacement than that hood. Who is the scoundrel responsible for this mechanical arrogance?" "That's the commander's ride," Ennie whispered, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with the raw, unadulterated lust of a master mechanic. "General von Zeller's personal G4. Look at those tires, Sam. They're reinforced. And the engine, I bet it's a 5-liter straight 8. It probably sounds like a choir of angry angels." "It sounds like a waste of perfectly good steel," I countered, though I found my own vacuum tubes warming with a certain unbidden curiosity. The sheer vanity of it is staggering. To have 6 wheels for a city with paved roads is like wearing 3 hats because you're afraid of a light breeze. It is a humbug of the highest order. "It's perfect," Ennie said, her eyes wide. "If we steal that, we don't just get a car. We take away his dignity. We take his throne." "Ennie, my dear, there is a fine line between taking a throne and committing spectacular suicide via a firing squad. That vehicle is likely guarded by half the German army and a very alert set of anti-aircraft guns. To steal it would be like trying to pickpocket a grizzly bear while wearing a suit made of honey." "He's going to the opera tonight," she said, ignoring my very sensible warnings. "Marcel told me. The Palais Garnier. The car will be parked in the VIP courtyard for at least 3 hours. 3 hours, Sam? I could dismantle a locomotive in 3 hours." "I have no doubt of your ability to reduce a machine to its component parts," I said. "It is the getting away with it part that concerns me. I am a 6-foot-tall brass gentleman. I do not blend. I am a localized industrial event. If I am seen in the driver's seat of the commander's Mercedes, it will not be considered a clever prank. It will be considered an act of war." "You won't be in the driver's seat," she grinned, her optimism reaching a level that I can only describe as weaponized. "You'll be the distraction. I'll be the ghost." I felt a sudden sharp rise in my boiler pressure. I do not like the sound of the distraction. In my experience, the distraction is the fellow who gets the brickbats thrown at him while the other fellow makes off with the silver. I have a very polished exterior, Ennie. I should hate to have it marred by a series of high-velocity lead projectiles. "Think of the legroom, Sam," she countered. "The G4 has a rear compartment that could fit a small choir. You could stretch out your actuators. You could even have a desk. Think of the snarky things you could write while we're doing 70 kilometers an hour down the highway." She had found my weakness. The prospect of superior legroom and a mobile writing desk was a siren song to a machine of my vintage. I looked at the G4 again as it turned the corner, the moonlight catching the silver Mercedes star on the radiator. It was a preposterous machine, built for a preposterous regime. "Legroom, you say?" I asked, my voice resonators producing a thoughtful hum. "Vast quantities of it. And the suspension. It's got leaf springs that could support a bridge. You won't feel a single Parisian cobblestone." I sighed, a sound like a steam engine admitting defeat. It is a terrible idea. It is a reckless, ill-conceived, and entirely undignified plan that will almost certainly lead to our glorious and premature destruction. "So you're in?" "I am in," I said, adjusting my oversized felt hat. "But I insist on a decent supply of anthracite for the journey. If I am to be a passenger in the commander's personal carriage, I refuse to be fueled by the geological equivalent of a bad mood. I wish to emit a smoke that suggests a certain level of aristocratic disdain." Ennie let out a yelp of joy and threw her arms around my cold copper midsection. "You're the best, Sam. We're going to be the most stylish rebels in history. We shall be the most stylish corpses in the morgue, more likely, I muttered, but I couldn't help the small blue spark of excitement that flickered in my tubes. We spent the next several hours in a state of high-tension preparation. Ennie was a whirlwind of activity, gathering tools, greasing hinges, and muttering to herself about compression ratios and fuel injection. I, meanwhile, spent my time contemplating the nature of audacity. I have often observed that the world belongs to the bold, primarily because the sensible people are too busy hiding under the bed to put up a fight. The Germans were bold, yes, but their boldness was a heavy, humorless thing. It was a boldness that expected obedience. Our boldness, however, was of the American variety, the kind that involves a certain amount of watch this and a total disregard for the odds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the city, we began our trek toward the Palais Garnier. I wore my trench coat buttoned to the chin, my hat pulled low, and I moved with the stiff, purposeful gait of a man who was very important and also possibly made of iron. "Stay in the shadows," Ennie whispered, her hand on her tool bag. "I am a shadow," I lied, "a shadow that weighs 600 pounds and makes a sound like a clock shop in a windstorm, but I am doing my best." The Opera House loomed ahead of us, a magnificent marble wedding cake of a building currently swarming with the elite of the occupation. Limousines were lined up like beetles at a feast, their drivers standing in stiff, bored groups. And there, in the center of the VIP courtyard, sat the G4. It looked even larger up close, a black mountain of steel and chrome. "There it is," Ennie breathed. "And there," I noted, pointing with a brass finger toward the entrance, "is the sergeant-at-arms, a man whose mustache suggests he has never laughed at anything in his entire life, including his own reflection. He is currently standing approximately 5 feet from the commander's bumper." "Don't worry about him," Ennie said, her eyes flashing with that familiar, terrifying spark. "He's about to have a very loud, very confusing evening." "And what is my role in this confusing evening?" I asked. "When I give the signal, Sam, I want you to go to the other side of the courtyard. I want you to find the most expensive-looking car that isn't the Mercedes, and I want you to make it complain." "Complain? Ennie, I am a satirist, not a car thief's apprentice." "Just blow a fuse, Sam. Make a noise. Hiss. Whistle. Do that thing where you sound like a dying tugboat. Just get everyone to look at you for 30 seconds. 30 seconds, I repeated. In 30 seconds, a man of my standing can deliver a very pithy lecture on the fall of the Roman Empire. I suppose I can manage a tugboat impression. Good. Now get in position. When you hear the whistle, let her rip. I moved through the darkness, my gears click in a quiet, nervous rhythm. I found myself behind a silver horse, a vehicle that looked like it belonged to someone who enjoyed shouting at servants. I crouched, a process that involved a significant amount of internal protest, and waited. The air was cold, the smell of expensive perfume and cheap tobacco wafting from the opera house. I looked at the Mercedes, standing there in its arrogant glory. It was a symbol of everything we were fighting, the weight, the coldness, the sheer unblinking certainty of the master race. And then I heard it, a sharp, low whistle. I didn't hesitate. I reached deep into my primary steam chest and opened the emergency vent. At the same time, I pulsed my vocal resonators at a frequency designed to mimic the sound of a catastrophic boiler failure. Hoo-wee! The sound was magnificent. It was a shrieking, whistling, thundering roar that echoed off the marble walls of the Palais Garnier like the scream of a banshee with a megaphone. A plume of white steam erupted from my shoulder vents, filling the courtyard with a thick, peppermint-scented fog. "Was is das?" a voice screamed. "The engine! It is exploding!" another yelled. I saw the guards, the drivers, and the sergeant-at-arms all turn as one toward the silver horror, their eyes wide with terror. They ran toward the steam, shouting orders and waving their arms. In the chaos, I saw a small, dark shadow dart toward the Mercedes. It was Ennie. She moved like a cat, reaching under the chassis, clicking a latch, and disappearing into the driver's side. I kept up the performance for exactly 25 seconds, adding a series of rhythmic bang, bang, bangs for dramatic effect. Then I cut the steam, ducked low, and moved with a speed that would have surprised a much younger machine. I reached the back of the Mercedes just as the engine roared to life. It didn't sputter. It growled, a deep, guttural, 8-cylinder symphony of power. "Get in, Sam! Get in!" Annie's voice came from the front, sharp and urgent. I didn't wait. I hauled myself into the rear compartment, my brass weight making the leaf springs groan. I barely had time to settle into the leather seat, which was, as promised, exceptionally comfortable, before the car lurched forward. We didn't just drive, we launched. Ennie threw the G4 into gear, the 6 wheels biting into the pavement with a ferocity that sent gravel flying into the faces of the stunned German guards. We tore through the courtyard, smashed through a wooden barrier, and shot out onto the Boulevard des Capucines. "We did it!" Ennie shrieked, her hair flying in the wind as she gripped the massive steering wheel. "Sam, we've got it! We've got the commander's ride!" I sat back in the plush leather, my optical sensors adjusting to the blur of the passing city. I looked at the mahogany trim, the polished chrome dials, and the vast, glorious expanse of legroom. "I must admit," I rumbled, my voice resonating through the frame of the car, "the suspension is remarkable. I feel like I am floating on a cloud of stolen Nazi engineering, though I do believe we have left a certain amount of property damage in our wake." "It's a revolution, Sam. Property damage is part of the charm." Behind us, I saw the distant lights of the Opera House fading. We were in a black Mercedes G4, speeding through the heart of occupied Paris, fueled by audacity and a very loud steam whistle. "Ennie!" I called out over the roar of the engine. "Yeah, Sam?" "I've decided I like this car. But we must do something about the hood ornament. A 3-pointed star is all well and good, but I think a small brass riverboat would be much more appropriate for a vessel of this magnitude." She laughed, a bright, defiant sound that was louder than the engine, louder than the war, and certainly louder than any German order. We were the gears of resistance, and tonight we were driving the biggest gear in the whole damn machine. "Next stop, the safe house," she shouted. "And after that," I added, settling into my seat, "I believe I shall write a very long, very snarky letter to General von Zeller. I want to thank him for the excellent legroom. It really is a game-changer." As the Mercedes hummed through the dark streets, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The Citroën was gone, but the road was still open. And as a former pilot, I knew that As long as you have a good engine and a bit of nerve, you can navigate even the darkest of waters, even if those waters happen to be paved with cobblestones and guarded by men in gray. So, there we were, a brass ghost with a penchant for prose, a young woman with a wrench and a dream, and a six-wheeled mountain of German vanity currently hurtling through the streets of Paris. We had successfully traded a sputtering Citroën for a vehicle that possesses more chrome than some small nations possess dignity. But as I've often observed, the trouble with catching a tiger by the tail is that eventually the tiger wants to know what you intend to do with the rest of him. Acquiring a general's personal carriage is a fine opening act, but the second act promises to be significantly more incendiary. Ennie has a look in her eye that suggests the Mercedes is about to undergo a series of metallurgical adjustments that would give the engineers in Stuttgart a collective stroke. Meanwhile, I have several thousand words left to say to the occupation, and I intend to project them from the highest heights of the city, though I suspect the German high command sense of humor is unlikely to improve with the next edition of the morning news. The stakes are rising, the vacuum tubes are humming, and the Gestapo is starting to wonder why their premier staff car is suddenly being used for grocery runs and midnight artistic displays. Don't go far, dear listener. The gears are just beginning to mesh, and the gears of resistance have a great deal more mischief to grind out before the sun sets on this particular empire. Stay tuned for part 2, coming soon. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but at least this time we've got the leg room to enjoy the catastrophe.